In 2003, a geophysicist named Jorg Fassbinder was asked about a gray picture of the ground under a dead city in Iraq. He had walked a machine across more than 100 hectares. In the dry bed of the Euphrates, it showed a building. They mapped it. They did not dig it. And the reason nobody has ever put a spade into it is not archaeological. 6 weeks after the story ran, the war started. The museum in Baghdad was looted. The German team did not get back to Uruk until 2016, and when they came back, they dug the city wall, and a large building outside the wall, and a cemetery to the south. 1. The Euphrates dammed, pushed aside, the grave built in its bed. Number 2. Stone, in a country with no stone. Walls, thresholds, door pivots, diorite. 3. Gold beams, and castings of gold, in a country with none. 4. Dark soil, a thick layer of it, so searchers find nothing. 5. His beloved wife. The text gives a rank, never a name. 6. His beloved children, plural. A king list names a surviving son. 7. His beloved favorite and junior wife, listed separately, below the children. 8. His beloved musician. At Ur, lyres were found beside human bodies. 9. His cupbearer, a small clay cup argued over for 90 years. 10. His beloved barber, the most ordinary name on the entire list. 11. His retainers, his servants, and his beloved objects in one sentence. 12. Presents, for the officials of the underworld and its dead clergy. The German team did not get back to Uruk until 2016, and when they came back, they dug the city wall, and a large building outside the wall, and a cemetery to the south. Everywhere except there. Uruk has been excavated for 170 years, and the one patch of ground nobody has ever cut into is the patch the poem tells you to dig. This is going to take about 3 hours. We will go through all 12, in the order the tablet gives them, and every time I make a claim, I will give you the museum number, the editor, and the year, so you can check me. If you have ever read a headline about an ancient discovery and wanted to know what was actually underneath it, the object, the number, the name of the person who found it, then take 1 second now and subscribe. A slow 3-hour video about a broken tablet does not travel unless you tell the machine to carry it. Here is what the tablet says went in with him, in order. That last one is what the title points at. Nobody brings gifts to a thing that merely happens. So let me show you the object, because it is the only thing in this story that anybody can actually hold. It is in Philadelphia. It is in a drawer in the Babylonian section of the University of Pennsylvania Museum of Archaeology and Anthropology, and it has been in that building longer than anyone now working there has been alive. Its number is CBS 6966. CBS is not a code. It stands for Catalog of the Babylonian Section, which is a filing system. In the International Database of Cuneiform, the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, the same object is P264388, and the composition it carries is cataloged as Q000363, the Death of Gilgamesh Nippur version. It is a piece of fired clay, broken, with the middle part surviving, and the reverse only partly preserved. Old Babylonian, written somewhere between about 1900 and 1600 years before the Common Era, and on it is the list. Now, you have almost certainly seen a Gilgamesh tablet, and it was not this one. The famous object is in London. On the 3rd of December, 1872, a man named George Smith stood up in front of the Society of Biblical Archaeology and read out a passage he had found on a broken tablet from the Palace Library at Nineveh. Smith was a self-taught banknote engraver with no university education, employed in the British Museum as a repairer and sorter, and what he had found on that piece of clay was a flood, a ship grounded on a mountain, and a bird sent out to look for land. The Prime Minister, William Ewart Gladstone, was in the room. The tablet is BMK 3375, 7th century before the Common Era, and it is on display in room 55 to this day. Smith went back to Nineveh and found the missing fragment on the 7th of May, 1873. 3 years after that, he was dead of dysentery near Aleppo at 36. That is the object that made the name Gilgamesh famous, and it deserves every word of that. But the flood tablet is not the object this video is about, because the flood tablet does not carry the inventory. The inventory is in Philadelphia in 6 pieces, and almost nobody outside the field has ever heard its number. So, how does a clay tablet from southern Iraq end up in a drawer in Pennsylvania? Between 1889 and 1900, the University of Pennsylvania ran 4 campaigns at the Mound of Nufur in southern Iraq, which is the site of the ancient city of Nippur. The first campaign was led by John Punnett Peters. Much of the digging on the ground was done under John Henry Haynes, the man in Philadelphia who studied and published the material, and who is the loudest name attached to that expedition. The architectural and documentary volumes were prepared by Clarence Stanley Fisher between 1905 and 1907. What came out of Nippur was not a treasure, it was paper. Tens of thousands of clay tablets, most of them broken, most of them school exercises, receipts, hymns, lists, the working literature, and the working paperwork of a Sumerian temple city. It was crated and shipped, and a very large part of it went into the catalog of the Babylonian section, where it was numbered, 1 piece at a time, by people who could not possibly read all of it, and who were not trying to. They were making an inventory. And this is the part I want you to hold on to, because the whole shape of this video is in it. CBS 6966 did not arrive as a tablet. It arrived as rubble. 6 separate fragments, 6 separate numbers, given at 6 separate moments by 6 separate hands. CBS 06966, CBS 07900, CBS 14109B, and 3 more carrying N numbers from a different part of the same collection. N1377, N3189, N3190. 6 catalog entries in the same institution, in the same city, describing what everyone believed were 6 unrelated scraps of broken clay among tens of thousands of others. They were 1 tablet. They had been 1 tablet the whole time, and it took 100 years for that to be established. The first publications of this material came from Edward Chera in 1934 in 2 volumes with 2 of the least dramatic titles in scholarship, Sumerian Epics and Myths, and Sumerian Texts of Varied Contents. Chera copied the signs from the Philadelphia pieces by hand and put the copies in print, which is what makes a tablet available to everybody, rather than only to whoever can get into the drawer. 45 years after the first spade went into Nufur, the fragments that make up CBS 6966 were finally on paper, where other scholars could argue with them. 10 years later, in 1944, Samuel Noah Kramer published the first critical edition and translation of the composition itself. It appeared in the Bulletin of the American Schools of Oriental Research, number 94, pages 2 to 12, under the title, The Death of Gilgamesh. That is the moment the list became readable in English. 1944, more than 50 years after the clay left Iraq, and the joins kept coming, long after both men were dead. Making a join is not glamorous work, and it is not done by machine. Somebody sits at a tray under a lamp with 2 lumps of clay from 2 different drawers and asks whether they were ever one thing. You look at the break itself, because a fracture surface has a shape, and it fits one other object on Earth and nothing else. You look at the curvature, because a tablet is not flat, and the swell of a fragment tells you roughly where on the tablet it sat. You look at the thickness, the color, the ruled lines the scribe drew, and whether those lines run on across the break at the right spacing. And above all, you look at the signs, because a wedge cut in half by a break will only complete itself one way. If the last half sign on one fragment and the first half sign on another make a real word in a real line of a composition you already know, you have it. Niek Veldhuis published the join of CBS 14109B in the Journal of Cuneiform Studies, volume 53, page 146. Jeremiah Peterson published the join of N1377 in the series Biblioteca del Próximo Oriente Antiguo, volume 9, page 69. Two scholars, generations apart, adding pieces to CBS 6966 that Chiera and Kramer never had in front of them, in the same building, out of a dig that started in 1889. That is why I keep saying 6 fragments, rather than a tablet. The list we are about to read was not found. It was assembled, slowly, by people whose names are on the papers, and the assembly is still going on. So look at what CBS 6966 actually is, as a physical thing. It is wreckage. It was smashed at some point that nobody recorded. It lay in the dirt of a dead city for 3,000 or 4,000 years. It was dug up in 6 separate acts by workmen who had no idea the pieces belonged to each other. It crossed an ocean. It sat in 6 drawers in Philadelphia while people walked past it. And it had to be reassembled out of rubble, by hand, across a century, before any human being could read what was written on it. And even now, it is not finished. And I am going to be exact about this because it matters more than any other detail in the first hour. 2 lines of the roster cannot be read. Not disputed. Not uncertain. Gone. In the surviving text, there are 2 ellipses in the list of the household, and in each of them stood the name of a profession, in the same grammar as the wife and the musician and the barber, and the clay carrying those words has not turned up. There is no parallel to restore them from. There is no meter pushing them into place. 2 of the things buried with Gilgamesh, according to the tablet, are missing from the tablet, and nobody alive will know what they were unless another manuscript comes out of the ground. I will keep reading those holes out loud all night. Every time you hear me say ... that is a real gap in real clay, and I am not going to fill one for you. Nobody has ever opened the grave. But somebody wrote down what is inside, and the piece of clay they wrote it on, CBS 6966, has been in a drawer in Pennsylvania since the 1890s, in pieces. Before I open the list, you need to know exactly what else this video is standing on, and you need to hear the strongest argument against it from me rather than from a comment. Before the first of the 12, you need to know what this video is working from, and you need the mainstream position at full strength, because tonight stands on published texts and published excavations, and I hold both to the same standard. Start with the corpus, because the fastest way for me to lose you would be to wave at ancient texts without saying which ones. The composition is called The Death of Gilgamesh, and it survives on 10 manuscripts. 3 are in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, headed by the tablet I just described. 3 are in the Archaeology Museleri in Istanbul. 3 are in the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad, and for those 3 the International Catalog records no museum number at all, and the 10th is in a private collection in Oslo, the Shoyen, numbered MS 3027, with its provenience recorded as uncertain. Nobody can say which mound that one came from, or who dug it, or who sold it. Now the editions, with names and years, so you can check every line I read. The modern edition of the fullest manuscripts is Antoine Cavigno, of Geneva, and Farouk Al-Rawi, of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London, published in the year 2000 as Gilgamesh et la Mort. Cuneiform Monographs, number 19. Andrew George of the University of London gives the same composition in English in his Penguin edition of 1999, at pages 195 to 208. The translation I will read aloud is the public one, the electronic text corpus of Sumerian literature at the University of Oxford, 1.8.1.3, prepared by Jeremy Black, Graham Cunningham, Eleanor Robson, and Gabor Zoliomi. Every quotation tonight comes from that translation, and it goes on screen with its number. And the reason we can read the fullest version of this funeral at all is an emergency. In 1979, Iraqi archaeologists began a rescue dig ahead of the flooding of the Hamrin Basin in the Diyala. The site was Tel Haddad, ancient Meitzran, and the names on the work include Nail Hanoun and Burhan Shakir. It ran until the water came in 1984. About 1,000 tablets came out before the place went under, and among them were the best manuscripts of this text that exist. Then the archaeology, because half of tonight is not text at all. Between 1922 and 1934, Sir Charles Leonard Woolley directed a joint expedition of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum at Ur. He excavated roughly 1,850 graves and classed 16 of them as royal tombs. The date is early dynastic 3A, about 2,600 to 2,450 before the Common Era, and the finds were split 3 ways, between Baghdad, London, and Philadelphia. 2 later studies matter tonight. Peter Rogers Stuart Morey in the Penn Museum's Magazine Expedition, Volume 20, Number 1, 1977, and Bodsgaard, Monge, Cox, and Zettler in the Journal Antiquity, Volume 85, Number 327, 2011, pages 27 to 42. And for Uruk, the magnetometer program initiated by Margaret van S. of the German Archaeological Institute in Baghdad and walked by Jörg Fassbinder of Munich, with Fassbinder's own summary of the whole survey published by the American Society of Overseas Research in 2020. For the succession, the Sumerian king list on the Weld Blundell prism, in the Ashmolean at Oxford, AN 1923.444, published by Stephen Langdon in 1923. Now the mainstream position at full weight because it is held by people who read Sumerian better than I ever will. A scholar will tell you that this passage is royal ideology, not reportage. That the buried under a river motif belongs to a worldwide family of tales about the unfindable royal grave. That a stone chamber in a country with no stone is a boast about reach. And that the phrase rendered laid down in their places is genuinely ambiguous in Sumerian and will bear a right as easily as a body. Then the hardest version of it, which you are hearing now rather than at the end. Johannes van Dyck, in 1967, connected part of this material to VAT 8382, a bilingual royal ritual. Klaus Wilke, in 1970, connected it to a fate decision for the dead Ur-Nama, a different king of a later dynasty. Both are cited in the standard bibliography of this composition. Put them together, and you get a serious proposition that this funeral is a reusable liturgy, a form for burying any dead king, into which you drop whichever king has just died. If that is right, this is a ceremony and not one man's grave, and I cannot refute it. So here is the narrower thing I am arguing. Not that a tomb has been found, because none has. Not that this is a dig report, because it is not. The argument is that a real Sumerian composition, published by named editors, itemizes what went into a royal grave. That 400 kilometers downriver at Ur, we can stand on the floor where that practice was carried out, and that the 12th entry explains the other 11. And the honesty rules, since you are giving me 3 hours. 3 of the 12 are genuinely contested, and I will hand the skeptics the microphone on each. Whether those people chose or were killed, who was selected and why, and whether this text describes a grave at all. Where the Oxford editors print a question mark, I will say the word uncertain. Where the clay is broken, I will read the gap. I will not give you a name for his wife, because the text does not have one. And one thing here, I am going to destroy myself, on purpose. The photograph of the giant skeleton in the trench. It is a fake. I know who made it and when, and you will hear me say so before anybody sells it to you. So we start where the tablet starts. So we begin with the first of the 12, and I want you to notice immediately that it is not an object. It is not gold, and it is not a body. According to the tablet, the first thing that went into the grave of Gilgamesh was a river. The text is called The Death of Gilgamesh. In Sumerian, the hero's older name is Bilgamesh, and you will see the text titled The Death of Bilgames in some editions for that reason. It survives on 10 manuscripts. 3 of them are in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, 3 in the Archaeologie Museleri in Istanbul, 3 in the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad, and 1 in a private collection in Oslo. The fullest version of the funeral passage comes from a place called Meyturan, modern Tel Haddad in the Diyala, and it was published by Antoine Cavigno of Geneva and Farouk Al-Rawi of the School of Oriental and African Studies in London in the year 2000, in a book called Gilgamesh et la Mort, Cuneiform Monographs number 19. The English translation I am reading from is the public one, From the Electronic Text Corpus of Sumerian Literature at the University of Oxford, Catalog number 1.8.1.3. Prepared by Jeremy Black, Graham Cunningham, Eleanor Robson, and Gabor Zulyomi. Andrew George of the University of London gives the same passage in his Penguin edition of 1999 at pages 195 to 208. 3 separate editions. Same lines. You can go and check every one of them. And the object I want you to hold in your head for the next 3 hours is a broken piece of clay in a drawer in Pennsylvania. Its museum number is CBS 6966. CBS stands for Catalog of the Babylonian Section. Its number in the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative is P264388. It is the Nippur manuscript of the Death of Gilgamesh, Old Babylonian, written somewhere between about 1900 and 1600 years before the Common Era, and it came out of the mound of Nufur in southern Iraq during the University of Pennsylvania's 4 campaigns at Nippur between 1889 and 1900. It reached Philadelphia in pieces, 6 pieces, cataloged separately, under separate numbers, sitting in the same building for decades without anyone realizing they belonged to each other. Nobody has ever opened the grave. But the receipt for it has been in a drawer in Pennsylvania since the 1890s, in pieces, and it took 100 years to put the pieces back together well enough to read the list. Here is what the list opens with, the Oxford translation verbatim. Quote, "The Lord imposed a levy on his city." End quote. Then the call goes out, and the 2 districts of the city are named by their Sumerian names. Quote, Unug, arise, open up the Euphrates. Kulaba, arise, divert the waters of the Euphrates. End quote. Unug is the Sumerian name for the city we call Uruk. Kulaba is the district beside it. And then the text does something that no myth in my experience does. It brags about the schedule. Quote, "It was not 5 or 10 days before they had opened up the Euphrates and diverted its high water." End quote. And then, quote, "Then, as soon as the water in the bed of the Euphrates had receded, his tomb was built there from stone." End quote. Read that as an engineer would read it, and you get 4 separate operations in the right order. A labor call-up, a diversion of a live river, a wait for the bed to dry, and then construction in the dry channel, out of stone, not a vision, not a vault in the sky, a work order with a start date. Now the mainstream reading, and I am going to give it to you at its full strength, because it is a good argument and it is made by people who read Sumerian better than I ever will. A historian of religion will tell you that the riverbed burial is a story shape, not an engineering report. It belongs to a family of tales about the unfindable royal grave, and that family is enormous, and it is very old, and it crosses cultures that had no contact with each other. Herodotus tells you a structurally identical story about a Babylonian queen. The Goths are said to have done exactly this for Alaric in the bed of the Bucento, diverting the water, burying the king, letting the river back, and then killing the workmen so that no one could point to the spot. The Sumerian passage on this reading is doing the same job as those stories. Its purpose is not to record what happened to one body in the 3rd millennium. Its purpose is to say, this king is beyond your reach forever, and the proof is that you cannot go and look, and that reading is strengthened, not weakened, by the fact that a river is the perfect literary lid. Water is the one cover that closes itself. You cannot dig a hole in a river. And I want to give that motif its full weight for another minute, because I think most people underrate how strong it is. Why does the unfindable grave exist as a story at all? Because grave robbery was the single greatest practical threat to a royal burial anywhere in the ancient world, and everybody involved knew it. The people who built the tomb knew it. The people who filled it knew it. The king who ordered it knew it while he was still alive. And so every culture that put wealth in the ground developed a set of answers, and those answers are more or less the same everywhere. Go deeper, make it heavier, seal it better, hide the entrance, lie about the location, and, in the most extreme cases, kill the people who know. The story of the workmen killed after the burial of Alaric is attached to the Bucento for exactly that reason. It is the logical end of the same thinking. So a tale in which a king is buried beneath a river is not evidence of anything, except that ancient people had the same problem we would have, and reached the obvious conclusion. Water is the perfect lid because water is self-repairing. A hole in the ground can be reopened by anyone with a basket. A hole under a live river cannot be reopened by anyone at all, because the moment you break the cap, the channel comes in on top of you. That is a serious explanation, and it is probably the majority view. Now I want to put 4 things beside it, because the passage does something that a pure motif does not usually do. The first thing is the levy. The Sumerian world ran on a labor obligation. Cities called up their households and put them on the canals for a season, and we know this not from poems, but from thousands of dull clay receipts. Because when a bureaucracy conscripts a man, it writes his name down and records the barley it fed him. Diverting a channel of the Euphrates is exactly the kind of task that machinery existed for. This is a civilization that built and maintained hundreds of kilometers of water channel with baskets, mattocks, reed bundles, and human backs. When the text says, "The Lord imposed a levy on his city, and the herald sounded the horn," it is not describing a miracle. It is describing a Tuesday. And here is the part that lands. The survey of Uruk that we are going to come to in a moment has actually drawn those water channels for us. Jorg Fassbinder published the picture in 2020 and described canals in 3 or 4 distinct widths crossing the city, and one main canal 10 meters wide that his instrument could follow for 400 meters. The city in the poem is a city that moved water. The city in the ground is a city that moved water. That is not proof of a grave. It is proof that the poem knew what the city was for. And I want to walk you through how you would actually do it. Because the sentence open up, the Euphrates sounds impossible, and it is not. You do not stop a river. Nobody in the 3rd millennium before the Common Era stops the Euphrates, and nobody today would try. What you do is take the water somewhere else. The Euphrates on that plain is not a single deep channel between rock walls. It is a shallow, silty, branching thing, running between banks. It has built out of its own sediment, and it splits into arms on its own without anybody's help. So you find the point where the channel you want dry runs beside a lower line of ground, an old bed, a depression, a canal that is already there. You put thousands of people on the low bank with baskets and mattocks and reed bundles, and you cut it. The water goes where the ground falls, and once the flow has gone into the new line, the old channel does not need to be plugged against a torrent. It needs a modest barrier across a diminishing flow, which is a job you can do with rubble, brushwood, reed matting, and earth. Then you wait. And southern Iraq in summer is very good at drying things. The text says the levy was imposed and the herald sounded the horn. In administrative terms, that is a call-up. The households of the city owe labor, the obligation is announced publicly, and the gangs assemble. This is the same obligation that dug and maintained the canals, and it is documented in tens of thousands of tablets doing exactly that, unglamorously, for centuries. So the operation the poem describes is not a wonder. It is the ordinary annual competence of a Sumerian city, pointed at one target for a few weeks. The second thing is the boast about speed. It was not 5 or 10 days. Listen to what kind of sentence that is. That is not the language of gods and portents. That is the language of a foreman. Nobody writes a fairy tale in which the marvel is that the job came in ahead of schedule. The claim being made in that line is about how many people the crown could put in the mud at once and how fast. It is a labor claim, dressed as a wonder. The third thing is the river itself. And this is where it gets uncomfortable for everybody, including me. The Euphrates does not stay where it is. It is a silt river running across a flat plain, and over centuries, it lifts its own bed, breaks its banks, and walks sideways across the country. Uruk was built on a channel of the Euphrates. The river is not there now. The ruined field at Warka, which is the modern Arabic name of the place, sits away from where the water runs today. And one of the reasons Uruk died at all is that combination. The channel migrated away, and the fields that had been irrigated for millennia went salty. The water left, and the earth turned white, which means the thing the poem calls the bed of the Euphrates is not underwater today. It is dry ground. You can stand on it. You can walk a machine across it. And in 2001 and 2002, somebody did. Here is what happened, and I want you to hear it from me rather than from a comment. A German-led team ran a magnetometer survey over the ruins of Uruk. The program was begun by Margaret van Es, the director of the German Archaeological Institute in Baghdad. The man walking the instrument was Jörg Fassbinder of the Bavarian State Department of Monuments and Sites in Munich. A magnetometer does not dig. It has no blade and it removes nothing. It reads tiny differences in the magnetic signature of the soil, because mud brick that has been heated, and river silt, and the fill of an old ditch all sit differently in the Earth's magnetic field. So you carry a cesium magnetometer about 30 centimeters above the ground, and you walk, back and forth, line after line, over more than 100 hectares. And what comes out the other end is a gray picture of what lies under the dirt, down to about 3 meters, without lifting a single spadeful. Ground-penetrating radar does not work at Uruk, incidentally, because of the salt and the clay. The magnetometer was the only tool that could see anything at all. What they got was a town plan of a city that has been dead for 2,000 years. Streets, gardens, field boundaries, Babylonian houses, canals cutting through the built-up ground like roads. Fassbinder told the BBC World Service that it was, his phrase, like Venice in the desert. And out beyond the edge of the city, in the middle of what used to be the bed of the Euphrates, the picture showed a building. On Tuesday, the 29th of April, 2003, the BBC ran the story under a headline that has been rotting on the internet ever since. Gilgamesh tomb believed found. Now here's what the man himself actually said, and I want you to notice how careful he was. Quote, "I don't want to say definitely it was the grave of King Gilgamesh, but it looks very similar to that described in the epic." End quote. And, quote, "We found just outside the city an area in the middle of the former Euphrates River, the remains of such a building which could be interpreted as a burial." End quote. Could be interpreted as, that is a geophysicist describing a shadow in a magnetic field, honestly, in a language that is not his own, to a radio program. And now the part that almost nobody repeats. It was never excavated. Within weeks the war started. The Iraq Museum in Baghdad was looted. The German team did not get back to Uruk until 2016, and when they did come back, they dug at the city wall, and at a large building outside the city wall, and they recorded graves in a cemetery south of the city. They ran more survey. They mapped more canals, and in 2020, Fassbinder wrote up the whole program himself, 2001 through 2019, in an article for the American Society of Overseas Research, and in that article, the tomb of Gilgamesh is not mentioned even once. The only time he writes the name at all is to say that the city was the setting of the epic. I am going to phrase that precisely, because precision is the entire currency of this channel. I am not telling you he retracted it. I have no document in which he retracts it. I am telling you that in his own summary of his own 20-year survey, the tomb is absent. That is an absence in a named publication, and it is all I can honestly claim. So let me be as plain as I can be. No tomb was opened. No sarcophagus was lifted. No body was found. No giant was found. No American soldier carried anything out of that riverbed. And that last claim, which you will have seen, has no source of any kind behind it. It is not thinly sourced. It is not disputed. It has no source at all. And while we are here, let me kill the photograph, because you have seen the photograph. The enormous skeleton in the trench with the little men standing around it in sun hats. That image was made by a Canadian digital artist working under the handle Ironkite. He took an aerial photograph of a mastodon excavation at Hyde Park in New York State, and he composited a human skeleton onto it. It took him roughly 90 minutes. He entered it in a photo manipulation contest called Archaeological Anomalies 2 on a website called Worth 1000 in 2002. It came third. By 2004, it was circulating as a real discovery, and it has been relabeled ever since. A giant in India, a giant in Saudi Arabia, the skeleton of Goliath, and most recently, the intact body of Gilgamesh, lifted out of the Euphrates when the river ran low. One picture. 90 minutes of work, 22 years of lies, and a different lie each time. So there is nothing in that riverbed that any human being has ever looked at. And there is one more sentence I need you to stop repeating, because it is on 100 content farms and it is wrong. The site does not remain untouched to this day. Uruk was excavated in 2016, in 2018, and in 2019. The true sentence, the one that is actually stronger, is narrower. The structure in the riverbed has never been excavated, and I want to be fair about how much digging has actually happened at that ruin, because when people hear never excavated, they picture an empty desert that nobody has ever visited, and that is nothing like the truth. Uruk is one of the most thoroughly worked archaeological sites on Earth. The first Westerner to put a spade in it was William Kennett Loftus, who scouted the place in 1849 and dug there from 1850 to 1854, work he himself described as superficial. Then, from the 14th of November, 1912, to the 12th of May, 1913, with Conrad Preußer concentrating on the Iana district and on the complexes of the sky god Anu. Jordan went on to become Director of Antiquities in Baghdad in 1931. After him came Arnold Noldeck, working from 1928 to 1939 until the war stopped them. Lenson again from 1954 to 1967. Jürgen Schmidt from 1968. Rainer Michael Boehmer from 1978. And Margaret van Es of the German Archaeological Institute in Baghdad from 2001. That is more than 170 years of excavation by 4 generations of archaeologists at one site. They have dug the temple terraces. They have dug the Iana, where the earliest writing in the world comes from. They have dug the ziggurat of Anu, which in a much later period was described as the largest ever built in Mesopotamia. They have dug houses and gates and the Great Wall, and since 2016 they have dug the wall again, and a large building beyond it, and a cemetery to the south. So it is not an untouched site. It is one of the most touched sites there is. And in 170 years of digging, at a place that has been cut open by Germans, by Britons, and by Iraqis in 9 separate campaigns under a dozen directors, the one thing nobody has ever put a trench into is the shape in the dry riverbed. Not because it is forbidden, because of timing. Because a war started 6 weeks after the headline, and because the years after that were not years in which anyone opens a new excavation in southern Iraq on the strength of a magnetic anomaly, which leaves us where we started, holding a piece of clay. CBS 6966 and its joined fragments say the river was pushed aside, and the grave was built in the dry bed, and the water was let back over the top. And the one patch of ground at Uruk that nobody has ever put a spade into is the one patch of ground the poem tells you to dig. That is item 1, a river, used as a lid, and it takes us straight into item 2, which is its exact opposite. Because where item 1 is the largest thing in the country and it was already there, item 2 is a material that the country does not have at all, and every single piece of it had to be carried in from somewhere else. The river was free, the stone was not. The source for item 2 is the same composition, The Death of Gilgamesh, in the Mi-Turan manuscripts published by Antoine Cavigno and Farouk Al-Rawi in 2000, with the parallel passage in the Nippur version that sits on CBS 6966 and its joins in Philadelphia. Same translation, the Oxford Corpus 1.8.1.3. Here is what it says, verbatim. Quote, "Then, as soon as the water in the bed of the Euphrates had receded, his tomb was built there from stone. Its walls were built from stone." End quote. And then the text narrows down, the way a specification narrows down. Quote, "Its bolt and thresholds were hard stone. Its door pivots were hard stone." End quote. And in the Nippur version, broken, with the gaps in it that I am going to keep reading out loud to you all night, we get a specific rock named. Quote, ... were hard diorite. ... its latches were hard stone." End quote. I read those ellipses on purpose. The tablet is damaged. Words are missing. I am not going to fill them in for you, and I am not going to pretend they are not there. And every time you hear me say ... tonight, that is a real hole in real clay. Now hold the specification in your head. Walls, stone. Bolt, hard stone. Thresholds, hard stone. Door pivots, hard stone. latches, hard stone, some of it diorite. That is 5 named components, sorted by material grade. And the country in which this grave is supposedly being built has no stone. I want to be exact about that, because it is the single most underrated fact about Sumer, and it is the reason everything else in this video looks the way it looks. Southern Iraq is an alluvial plain. It is the silt of 2 rivers laid down over an enormous span of time, and what that gives you is superb farmland and essentially nothing else. No building stone, no timber worth the name, reeds and date palm makes a poor beam. No metal ore, no flint. If you stand in the middle of the plain and look around, the only construction material within reach in any direction is mud and water and reed and your own hands. So a scholar of Mesopotamia will tell you, and I think correctly, that a stone tomb in that landscape is not a construction detail at all. It is a boast about reach. It is a sentence about how far the arm of the state extends. Everything monumental in Sumer is mud brick. The temples, the terraces, the ziggurats, the city walls. When a Sumerian text wants to say that a king was beyond the ordinary, one of the cleanest ways to say it is to say that his building was made of the material that has to come from a foreign country. On that reading, the stone in this passage sits in exactly the same register as the epic's famous boast about the walls of Uruk, where the ferryman is told to go and inspect the brickwork and see for himself that no later king ever equaled it. It is royal advertising. It is the 3rd millennium version of saying the floors were imported marble, and the specific rock named makes that reading stronger, not weaker. Diorite is a dark, dense, hard igneous rock, and in Mesopotamia it is the luxury stone. It is what the statues of Gudea of Lagash are carved from, the ones you have seen in photographs. The seated ruler with his hands folded and his shaven head, dark and heavy and polished. And Gudea's own inscriptions tell you where he got it, from Magan, which is generally identified with Oman and the Arabian side of the Gulf. That is a sea voyage. That is a boat, and a crew, and a season, and a foreign ruler who has to be dealt with for a block of rock. When a Sumerian scribe writes the word diorite, he is not naming a color. He is naming a supply line. And there is one more thing about diorite that makes it the right stone for this passage, which is that it is extremely hard to work. Soft stone can be cut with copper and sand and patience. Diorite cannot. It blunts everything. To carve a seated figure out of a block of it, at the size of the Gudea statues, with the tools available in the 3rd millennium, is a job measured in seasons of grinding and pounding by people who spent their working lives doing nothing else. And the finished surfaces are polished, smoothed, until they take the light, which is more work again, done by hand, with abrasive. So the material carries 2 costs stacked on top of each other. The first is the voyage, a boat, a crew, a foreign coast, and something valuable going the other way to pay for it. The second is the labor, which is enormous, and which can only be spent by somebody who does not need those hands for anything else. That is why diorite means what it means. It is the stone that proves you can afford both distance and time. And when the Nippur manuscript of the death of Gilgamesh, the broken tablet in the Penn Museum drawer, CBS 6966 with its 5 joins, CDLI number P264388, names hard diorite as a component of the tomb, it is making the largest claim available in the vocabulary of its world. Not the biggest, not the tallest, the most expensive per stone. That is the mainstream case, and it is strong. The stone is ideology. And before I put anything beside it, I want to stay inside that absence for a minute, because it explains more about this civilization than any single fact I know. Think about what it does to a people to be handed the best farmland in the world and none of the materials of building. You cannot quarry. You cannot fell a decent tree. You cannot smelt what you do not have. So you take the one thing you do have, river mud, and you turn it into everything. You mix it with chopped straw and dung. You press it into a wooden mold. You turn it out onto the ground, and you let the sun do the firing for nothing. That is the mud brick, and it is arguably the most consequential object the ancient Near East ever produced, because it is a building material with no upper limit. One man can make hundreds in a day. 10,000 men can make a mountain. The ziggurats are mud brick. The city walls of Uruk are mud brick, 9 meters thick, with the whole fortification about 40 meters wide overall, and a floodgate roughly 15 meters across in the south, running for something like 11 kilometers around a city of 4 or 5 kilometers across that held perhaps 40,000 people by 3,000 before the Common Era. And the second thing that absence does is turn a farming people into traders, whether they want to be or not. If you need copper, you must reach the Gulf. If you need timber, you must reach the mountains. If you need lapis, you must reach the far side of Iran. And to run that kind of long-distance exchange, you need to be able to record who sent what, to whom, on whose account, in what quantity, and on which boat. And it is at Uruk, in the district called Iana, that the first writing on earth appears. Writing does not begin as poetry. It begins as inventory. A civilization with no stone invented accounting because it had to import everything. And 4,000 years later, a poem written in that same script gives us an itemized list of a grave. The list in this video is a direct descendant of the shortage I have just described. So a stone tomb is the exact opposite of everything the country stands on. It is the one building that could not have been made out of the ground it stands in. Whether or not it was ever built, the choice to say it was built is a choice to say, this man is not made of the same mud as the rest of you. Now, here is the other side, and it rests on the shape of the list rather than on the fact of it. The text does not say stone once and move on. That is what a boast does. A boast says, his tomb was of stone, and gold, and lapis, and the gods marveled. What this text does instead is itemize. It separates walls from bolt, from threshold, from pivot, from latch, and then it grades the material. Ordinary stone for some of it, hard stone for the parts that take the wear, diorite named for at least one element. Look at which components it picks out. Thresholds, door pivots, latches, the bolt. Those are precisely the 5 places in a real door where a real building fails. The threshold is where a doorway wears through. The pivot is where the whole weight of a leaf grinds in a socket, thousands of times. The latch and the bolt are the parts that a thief attacks. Somebody who has never seen a stone building does not know to specify the pivots. That is not the vocabulary of a poet reaching for grandeur. That is the vocabulary of someone who has watched a door fail. And the door pivot is a real Mesopotamian object. Doors in Mesopotamia did not hang on hinges. A door leaf carried a vertical post at one edge, and the bottom of that post turned inside a socket set into the floor. Those sockets survive. You can see them in excavated doorways, worn into a smooth circular cup, sometimes with an inscription on them because a king would write his name on the stone that carried his temple's door. That is the object the poem specifies in hard stone, and the reason to make it hard stone is that a soft socket wears out and the door drops. So the honest position on item 2 is this. The passage is unquestionably making a status claim, and it is also using the vocabulary of somebody who knew how buildings are put together. Those two things are not in conflict. Sumerian royal writing is very often both. There is one more thing that has to go beside it, and it comes from 400 kilometers downriver. Between 1922 and 1934, a British archaeologist named Sir Charles Leonard Woolley directed a joint expedition of the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum at the site of Ur, as in poor. From the season of 1926 to 27 onward, he uncovered a burial ground that changed what anybody thought the third millennium was. Roughly 1,850 graves in the first count, with about another 260 identified later. And out of that mass, Woolley singled out 16 and called them royal tombs. His criteria were structural: a deep shaft, a ramp leading down into it, a built chamber at the bottom made of stone or of mud brick, and the presence of household servants buried at the same time as the principal. The date is early dynastic 3A, somewhere around 2600 to 2450, before the Common Era, which is, roughly, the window in which the tradition puts Gilgamesh. So when the poem says the chamber was built of stone at the bottom of a hole, that is not a fantasy about a technology Sumer did not have. Woolley built chambers at the bottom of deep pits, stone and brick, corbelled roofs in some of them, The poem is describing something the country could actually do in the century it says it was done, and we know that because a man with a trowel found 16 of them in a different city. That does not mean the Uruk grave exists. I want that line to stay clean. It means the specification is buildable. And I want to describe one of those chambers properly, because most people have the wrong picture. This is not a coffin in a hole. Woolley's deep graves are pits, some of them large enough to hold a wagon and the oxen to pull it, cut down through earlier burials and older rubbish, sometimes 10 meters down, with a sloped ramp cut into one side so that living people and living animals could walk down into them. At the bottom, against one end, sits the built chamber, walls of limestone, rubble, or of brick, a doorway, and a roof that in several cases is a true corbelled vault, courses of bricks stepped inward until they meet. The principal burial goes inside the chamber, and the pit outside the chamber, the open floor of it, at the foot of the ramp, is where the other bodies are. Hold that shape, because we are going to come back to it for 6 of the 12 items, a room and a floor outside the room, and everything on that floor arranged in rows. Now, the word royal in Woolley's 16 is doing more work than people notice, and I will give you the criticism now rather than saving it. Woolley defined a royal tomb partly by the presence of servants buried at the same moment, which means that when he then announced that royal tombs contain sacrificed servants, the sentence is slightly circular. He built the servants into the definition. Scholars have said so in print, and they are right to. It does not make the graves less real. It makes the label less informative than it sounds. And now I want to spend a minute on something that happened at Uruk itself, because it is the single most useful thing in this entire video, and it argues against my own premise. When Fassbinder's team finally came back to Uruk in 2016, they dug at the city wall. Now, the magnetogram, the gray picture the magnetometer draws, had shown the wall with a strong signature, and the natural reading of a strong signature like that is fired brick. Fired brick has been through a kiln. The heat rearranges the magnetic minerals in the clay, and the result glows on a magnetometer compared to the mud around it. So, strong signal, therefore burnt brick, therefore an expensive, high-status fortification. Reasonable. Standard. The kind of interpretation any competent geophysicist would offer. Then they dug it, and the bricks were not fired brick. They were mud bricks made from crushed ancient pottery. Somebody in antiquity had ground up broken pots and mixed the sherds into the mud, and every one of those sherds had been fired once already, centuries earlier, in a potter's kiln. So the wall carried the magnetic signature of fired material without being fired material. The instrument was not wrong. The reading of the instrument was wrong. Sit with that for a second, because it is the whole argument in one object. Here is a real, documented, on-site case at this exact ruin from this exact survey, in which a magnetic signature was interpreted one way by serious people and turned out on excavation to be something else. And it was a surprise. Fassbinder wrote it up as a surprise. That is why you dig before you announce. And it is the strongest reason to hold the 2003 headline loosely, which is exactly what the man who generated it was trying to do when he said the words could be interpreted as. The building in the riverbed is a shape in a magnetic field. Shapes in magnetic fields have been read wrong at this site, in print, within the last 10 years. I could have left that out. It weakens my premise. I am putting it in at item 2, an hour before you have committed your evening. Because if you find out at the end that I hit it, everything else I say tonight is worthless. So item 2 is stone, a material the country did not possess, specified component by component, by someone who knew which parts of a door wear out, and a warning from the same ruin about how easy it is to read the ground wrong. Which brings us to item 3, and item 3 is the inversion of item 2 in one specific way. Stone is heavy, structural, and worth nothing to a thief. Nobody robs a grave for a threshold. The next thing on the list is light enough to carry in one hand, does nothing structural at all, and is the single reason a grave gets opened. According to the tablet, they put gold in it. The lines are short. From the Mitterrand manuscripts. Quote, they installed its gold beams. End quote. And from the Nippur version, the one that sits on CBS 6966 in Philadelphia, a phrase with the clay broken away on either side of it. Quote, ... were cast in gold. End quote. Gold beams. Now the first job here is to take that phrase away from the picture it puts in your head, because the picture is wrong and the truth is better. The mainstream reading, at full strength, is that gold beams in a Sumerian text almost certainly means gilded beams. Gold leaf, hammered thin, laid over a core of wood or bitumen. And the reason we can be confident about that is not theory. It is that Woolley dug up the technique. The most famous object he pulled out of the ground at Ur is in the British Museum, number ME122200, and there is a twin of it in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. Woolley called it the ram in a thicket, after the verse in Genesis about the ram caught in a thicket by his horns, and the name stuck, and the name is wrong. The animal is a goat. It is about 45.7 centimeters high. It came out of the grave Woolley numbered PG1237 in the season of 1928 to 29. And here is how it is made. A wooden core, long since rotted, with gold leaf hammered over it and fixed down with a thin wash of bitumen. Natural tar, which the region has in abundance, and which is one of the few useful raw materials the plain actually produces. The horns and the fleece on the shoulders are lapis lazuli. The body fleece is shell. The legs are gold over wood. So when the poem says gold beams, what it most likely means is timber sheathed in gold foil. Thin. Lighter than it sounds. That is the sober reading, and I accept it. And now the other half, which is what people miss when they say thinner than it sounds, as if that settles it. Sumer has no gold. None. Not a gram of it comes out of the alluvial plain. Every piece of gold in every grave at Ur and every sheet of foil on every beam anywhere in southern Iraq was carried in from outside. The standard candidates in the literature are Anatolia, Iran, and the routes east toward the Indus. Thin gold over 100 meters of beam is still a very large quantity of a metal that has to be brought across mountains by somebody who wants something in exchange. And I want to describe the technique properly, because gold leaf is one of those phrases that everybody uses and almost nobody pictures. Gold is the most malleable metal there is. You can beat it out further than any other material without it tearing, and ancient goldsmiths knew this and pushed it to an extreme that is genuinely hard to believe. Sheets so thin that they are more like a skin than a metal, thin enough to be laid over a carved shape and pressed into every hollow of it with a wooden tool until the shape underneath comes through. A tiny quantity of gold covers an enormous area. That is the whole point of the technique. It is how a court that has to import every gram of the metal makes a room look solid. Underneath it is wood, and between the wood and the gold, in the ore objects, is bitumen. Bitumen is one of the very few useful raw materials the plain actually produces, seeping up out of the ground in the north and traded south. It is glue, it is waterproofing, it is mortar, and here it is the bed that holds the metal and the shell and the stone in place. So the picture behind the phrase gold beams is this. A carpenter shapes the timber. A worker beds it in tar. A goldsmith lays a skin of hammered metal over the tar and works it down. And 4,500 years later, the wood has vanished, the tar has gone brittle and black, and the skin of gold is still there, crumpled around nothing at all. That is what survives. That is what a museum case holds. And the lapis is worse. Lapis lazuli, the deep blue stone that is everywhere in the ore material, in the beards of bulls and the horns of goats and the beads on the bodies in the pits, comes overwhelmingly from one region on Earth in this period, Badakhshan, in what is now northeastern Afghanistan. That is roughly 2,400 kilometers from Ur, not by road. There was no road. That is 2,400 kilometers of mountain, desert, river, and other people's territory. And the blue stone made that journey routinely enough that a Sumerian jeweler could count on the supply. So look at what a rich Sumerian grave actually is, materially. Gold from the north or the east, lapis from Afghanistan, diorite from Oman, carnelian from the direction of the Indus, silver, copper, shell, Nothing in the room grew within 400 kilometers of the room. A royal Sumerian grave is not a pile of treasure. It is a diagram of a trade world, drawn in objects, buried in mud, 4,500 years ago, by people we are still occasionally told were primitive. Now the second thing gold does, and this is the reason it survives to be discussed at all. Everything organic in these graves is gone. The wood is gone, the cloth is gone. The leather and the reed and the rope are gone. What Woolley found in place of the wooden objects was, in many cases, a stain and a void, a shape in the soil where a thing used to be. And his response to that, which is genuinely one of the great pieces of fieldcraft in the history of the discipline, was to pour liquid plaster into the void and let it set, and lift out a cast of an object that had not physically existed for 4,000 years. That is how we have the shapes of the lyres. The instrument was air. He filled the air. The best example of it is the grave Woolley numbered PG 800, which he called the tomb of Queen Puabi. Almost everything in that chamber that we now display was, at the moment of excavation, either metal, stone, shell, or a hole in the dirt. The wooden furniture was a discoloration. The headdress was gold leaves, and lapis, and carnelian beads lying in a collapsed heap where the cloth and hair beneath them had gone, and it had to be reassembled by working out how the beads must have been strung. The great harp and the lyres were, physically, cavities. Plaster went into the cavities, and what came out was a face of a bull with a lapis beard. I want you to hold on to how strange that is. A significant part of what you see in a museum case labeled is not the object. It is a modern cast of the space the object left behind. We are looking at negatives. So in a grave like this, the only things that survive on their own terms are the stone and the metal, which means that the entire visual impression we have of Sumerian wealth, the gold, the blue, the gleam, is a survival artifact. It is what did not rot. The room was full of wood and cloth and color, and we lost all of it. And the third thing about gold, which points straight back at item 1 and closes the loop. Gold in a grave is a countdown. Woolley found grave after grave at already emptied, robbed in antiquity, sometimes robbed within a generation or two by people who knew exactly where to dig because they had been at the funeral. A royal burial is a public event. Half the city watches the goods go into the ground. That is the point of it. A burial that nobody sees is not a statement. And it is also the flaw, because everyone who watched now knows where the metal is. And the robbery was not always 4 men with baskets. Some of graves were cut into from above by later graves, dug by people who were burying their own dead, and who went straight through somebody else's chamber to do it. Some were entered along the old ramp, which is the obvious way in, and which the builders knew was the obvious way in. And in the tomb of Puabi, the chamber below her was robbed while hers was not. The thieves came down, took what was in the lower room, and either did not reach or did not bother with the room above. Woolley reconstructed some of these break-ins in detail from the way the fill was disturbed, and from what had been left behind in the hurry. Every royal culture that puts metal in the ground eventually discovers the same thing. The grave has enemies, and the enemies are usually local, and the enemies are usually soon. Egypt answered it with mass, with stone, with sealed passages and false chambers, and, eventually, with hidden valleys. The Sumerians of answered it by going deep and by filling the shaft. And the poem in front of us tonight describes a third answer, and it is the most extreme answer anyone ever proposed. Which is why the first item on this list is a river. You do not divert the Euphrates because it looks impressive in a poem. You divert the Euphrates because a grave under a river is a grave that cannot be dug up by 4 men with baskets on a moonless night. Item 1 and item 3 are the same decision seen from 2 ends. The gold is why the grave is worth robbing. The river is the answer to the gold, and that answer is not finished yet, because according to the tablet, they did not stop at the water. Item 3 was the thing that makes a grave a target. Item 4 is what they did on top of it, and where item 3 is the most visible substance in the ancient world. The thing that catches every lamp, item 4 is the opposite, a deliberate layer of dirt and a written instruction that the place must never be found. Same composition, same edition. The Death of Gilgamesh, Miturin version, published by Cavigno and Al-Rawi in the year 2000, translated in the Oxford Corpus at 1.8.1.3, with a parallel on the Nipper manuscripts including CBS 6966 in Philadelphia, and here the clay is at its worst. I am going to read it to you exactly as the editors print it, holes and all. Quote, ... was covered with a thick layer of dark soil. End quote. Then, quote, ... who are searching for it should not find its precinct. Question mark. He set up a solid house in the middle of Unug. End quote. And the Nippur version, which is worse again, gives us only this. Quote, ... should not find ... End quote. Notice the question mark. That is not me hedging. That is printed in the translation by the editors, because the reading of the word behind the English word precinct is uncertain. When a scholar puts a question mark inside a translation, they are telling you, this is my best reading, and I do not want you to build a house on it. I am going to say the word uncertain out loud right now, so that nobody can accuse me later of smuggling it past you. The line is broken, the reading is disputed, and what we have is a reconstruction. And even after all of that, what survives is remarkable, because what survives is a purpose clause, not a description, a reason. They put the soil on so that something would not happen. The thing that must not happen is that somebody finds the place. Now the mainstream reading at full strength, and it is the most sensible thing in the world. Concealment clauses are completely standard in Mesopotamian writing. Foundation deposits are buried under temple corners, with texts asking future kings to find them and honor them, or cursing them if they destroy them. Boundary stones carry long formulaic curses against anyone who moves them, defaces them, throws them in a river, or covers them with earth, and notice that covering with earth is on the list of things you can do to a monument to harm it. Funerary texts across the ancient Near East are worried, constantly, about disturbance. So a line saying that the burial was covered so that searchers would not find it is not exotic. It is the ordinary anxiety of a culture that put valuable things in the ground and knew perfectly well what people are like. And I want to make that concrete because the Mesopotamian habit of writing to the future is one of the most human things they did. When a king built or rebuilt a temple, he buried texts in the fabric of it, under a corner, in a wall, in a box. Those texts are addressed, explicitly, to whoever finds them, who is understood to be a king in some later century doing the same job. They say who built this, and when, and for which god. They ask the finder to treat the object with respect, and to put it back. And they curse him, in detail and at length, if he defaces it, or erases the name on it, or throws it in the water, or buries it in the earth where nobody will see it. The boundary stones of a later period do the same thing in the open. They mark a grant of land, and then they spend far more space on the curse than on the grant, calling down a list of named gods on anybody who moves the stone, breaks it, or hides it. So this is a culture that thinks constantly about the far future and about interference, about the fact that the ground is not safe, that later people will dig, and that the only defense a buried object has is a sentence. Against that background, a line in a funeral text saying, "The grave was covered so that searchers would not find it," is completely at home. It is the same anxiety in a different register. And there is a literary reading stacked on top of the practical one, which is that an unfindable grave is a permanently claimable grave. If nobody can go and look, then nobody can ever contradict the story, and the story stays available to every later king who wants to say he stands in that line. Concealment is a way of keeping a hero in circulation. That is the sober reading. Now here is the thing that falls out when you refuse to take the two halves of the passage separately. Read them together. The tomb is concealed under dark soil in the bed of the river outside the city, and then, in the very next breath, a second structure is set up, a solid house in the middle of Unug, inside the city, where everyone is. Two buildings, one that nobody may find, and one that stands in the middle of town. That is the classic pattern that Egyptologists and archaeologists of half a dozen cultures call the decoy and the cenotaph. A cenotaph is an empty tomb, a public monument, in an accessible place where mourners go, where offerings are made, where the state performs its grief, and the actual body goes somewhere else, quietly, with as few witnesses as can be managed. Egypt did exactly this at various periods. Later cultures did it constantly, and the reason is not mysticism. It is the arithmetic of item 3. If the funeral is a public event, and it has to be, then the crowd must be given a destination, and the metal must not be at that destination. And there is a second line in the Nippur version that sits very oddly beside this, which we will meet properly in a few minutes, where the household is said to have been laid down in their places in the purified, again, palace in the middle of Unug. In the middle of Unug, not in the riverbed. So on the face of the text, in the manuscripts as we have them, some of the funeral happens in a building inside the city, and some of it happens under the water outside it. I am not going to pretend I can resolve that. The text is broken in exactly the places where it would tell us. But you should know it is there, because it is the kind of untidiness that a fabricator smooths out, and a real damaged document does not. Now, the dark soil itself, and this is the subpoint where the archaeology is on our side, in a small, technical, unglamorous way. A deliberate covering layer is a real thing, and it is detectable. When archaeologists cut a section through a site, what they read is a sequence of layers, and layers laid down by human decision look different from layers laid down by water or wind or slow collapse. A capping layer, soil brought from somewhere and dumped to a consistent depth over a specific footprint, has edges. It has a flat top. Its composition does not match the material immediately beneath it because it was carried in. Whether the Sumerian phrase behind dark soil means river silt specifically, or a dark earth brought from cultivated ground, or something else entirely that we no longer have a word for, the operation described is one that leaves a trace, which is the quiet, deflating, honest point of item 4. The concealment described in the poem is exactly the sort of thing that would show up if anybody ever cut a trench there. And nobody ever has, which brings me to the irony, and I want to deliver it slowly, because it is the strangest thing in this whole video, and it is completely true. The tablet says the grave was covered so that those who search for it should not find its precinct. 4,000 years later, a machine that does not search in the ordinary sense, a machine that does not touch the ground, that cannot lift anything, that produces only a gray picture, walked over that floodplain and drew a shape. And the man carrying it said carefully that he did not want to say definitely that it was the grave. And then a war started, and the museum in Baghdad was looted, and 13 years passed. And when the archaeologists came back, they dug at the wall, and at a building outside the wall, and at a cemetery in the south. Everywhere, except there. Whether by accident or by design, the instruction in the poem has held. For 4,000 years, nobody has found its precinct, because nobody has been able to go and look. I do not think that is supernatural. I think it is a coincidence made of politics and geology and bad timing. But I am not going to pretend it is not an extraordinary coincidence. And I am not going to insult you by pretending I do not find it strange. So that is the first 4. And let me put them in a line before we go on. Because from here, the list stops being about materials and starts being about people. And I want the ground under you to be solid. 1. A river, dammed and pushed aside, and the grave built in the dry bed so that the water would sit on top of it forever. 2. Stone, in a country that has none, specified component by component down to the bolt and the pivots and the latches, with diorite, named for the hardest of it. 3. Gold, almost certainly gold leaf over wood and bitumen, which is the technique Woolley actually excavated at Ur, and which is also the reason a grave gets robbed. And 4. A thick layer of dark soil, and a written instruction that the place must never be found, followed immediately by a second, public building put up in the middle of the city. 4 things, and not one of them is a person yet. Everything so far is engineering. If you have got this far and you are still with me, take 1 second and subscribe. A slow 3-hour video about a broken tablet does not travel on its own. The machine buries it unless people tell it not to. And I would rather make these for the few thousand of you who actually want the citations than make something shorter for people who do not. And drop a comment telling me which of the 4 you think was the hardest to actually do. I think it was the river. I would like to be argued with. Now. From here, the list changes. And it changes in one sentence. Because item 4 was the last piece of construction, and item 5 is the first name on the roster. And the contrast between them is the whole reason this text is famous. Everything up to now could have been done by a work gang with baskets and mattocks. What comes next could not. The source for item 5 is the Nippur version, the section that the Oxford translation heads as another version from Nibru, lines 1 to 7, Nibru being the Sumerian name of Nippur, the city these manuscripts came out of. That means CBS 6966 and its joined fragments in Philadelphia, plus the other Nippur witnesses in Philadelphia and Istanbul. The same passage appears in the Mitaran manuscripts at segment H, lines 33 to 41, where it breaks off after the first 3 entries. I want to be careful here, and I will be careful every time. I know this passage stands in the Nippur manuscripts. I am not going to tell you which physical fragment of that 6-piece tablet the individual words sit on, because I have not confirmed it, and there is no version of this video in which I invent that detail to sound authoritative. And while we are standing at the head of the roster, this is the right moment to tell you where these manuscripts actually are, because the story of who holds the tablets of Gilgamesh is its own story, and it is not a comfortable one. 10 manuscripts of this composition are known. 3 of them are in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, including CBS 6966 with its joins, and CBS 8551 with a fragment numbered N6856 and a tablet numbered UM 29-16-086. 3 are in the Archaeologie Museleri in Istanbul, with excavation numbers from Nippur. Ni 4136, Ni 9536, Ni 9488. 3 are in the National Museum of Iraq in Baghdad, and for those 3, the digital catalog records no museum number at all. And the 10th. The 10th is in a private collection in Oslo. Its number there is MS 3027 in the Schoyen collection, and its provenience, the place it came out of the ground, is recorded in the International Catalog as uncertain. Read that again. One of the 10 surviving manuscripts of the text that tells you what was buried with Gilgamesh sits in a private collection in Norway, and nobody can say which mound it came out of, or who dug it, or who sold it, or when. That is not an accusation against anybody. It is a statement about the record, and the record is blank. And it is not an isolated case, because the most famous recent story about a Gilgamesh tablet is a story about exactly this. A cuneiform tablet carrying a passage of the epic was bought in a private sale in 2014 for a reported sum of around $1.67 million by Hobby Lobby for display in the Museum of the Bible in Washington. It had traveled with a provenance letter written by a dealer in 2007, and that letter was false. Homeland Security investigations seized the tablet from the museum in September of 2019. The Department of Justice ordered it forfeited in July of 2021, and it was formally repatriated to Iraq at a ceremony in Washington on the 23rd of September, 2021. I'm giving you that from press reporting. Smithsonian, National Public Radio, The Washington Post, and others report it consistently. And I am deliberately not telling you which tablet of the epic it carries, or where in Iraq it is now, because I could not reach the primary documents, and I am not going to guess. So look at the map of where this literature ended up. The Nineveh material, including the flood tablet, went to London in the 1850s. The Nippur material, including our anchor tablet, went to Philadelphia and Istanbul in the 1890s. The Mitaran material stayed in Baghdad, and I will tell you in a moment how it was rescued and what happened to the site it came from. One manuscript sits in Oslo with no find spot, and one had to be seized by federal agents from a museum and flown home. The oldest story we have about a man who could not accept an ending is, itself, an object with a very complicated ownership history. And since I raised it, the reason we can read the fullest version of this funeral at all is an emergency. In 1979, Iraqi archaeologists began a rescue excavation ahead of the flooding of the Hamran Basin, behind a new dam in the Diyala. The site was Tel Haddad, ancient Mitaran. The work was carried out by Iraqi salvage teams. The names on it include Nail Hanoun and Burhan Shakir, and it ran until the water came in 1984. Around 1,000 tablets came out of that ground before it went under. Among them were the fullest manuscripts of the death of Gilgamesh that exist, and they were published 16 years later by Antoine Cavigno and Farouk El-Rawi. The best surviving account of the funeral of Gilgamesh was pulled out of the dirt by an Iraqi rescue dig ahead of a reservoir, and the place it came from is now underwater. Here is the passage. Quote, "His beloved wife, his beloved children, his beloved favorite and junior wife," end quote. And then, after the whole list has run, the verb that governs all of it. Quote, "Were laid down in their places as if ... in the purified, palace in the middle of Unug," end quote. First name on the roster, the wife. And now I am going to do the thing that this channel exists to do, which is to tell you what we do not have. We do not have her name. The text does not give one. Not in the Nippur manuscripts, not in the Mitaran manuscripts, not in any version of this composition. She is a rank and an adjective, beloved wife. If you find a source that gives you a name for the wife of Gilgamesh in this passage, that name has been invented somewhere between the tablet and your screen, and I would like you to go and find out where. The mainstream reading, at full strength, and it is genuinely strong. The Sumerian here is formulaic. It is a household list in descending rank, of the kind that appears in administrative documents, and the phrase rendered laid down in their places is ambiguous in Sumerian in roughly the same way it is ambiguous in English. It could describe the placement of bodies. It could describe the placement of substitutes, figurines, images, or grave goods standing in for people, which is attested in other contexts in the ancient Near East. It could describe a ritual laying out during a funeral ceremony that everybody walked away from afterwards. The verb does not settle it. Anyone who tells you the Sumerian settles it is overselling. Let me lay the three readings of that verb out properly, because this is the hinge of the second half of the list, and I do not want to be caught having chosen one quietly. Reading 1. Bodies. They were killed, or they died, and they were placed. This is the reading that the archaeology at Ur makes available, and if this text were the only document we had, it would still be the plainest sense of the words. Reading 2. Substitutes. Figurines, images, or named objects standing in for the people, laid out in a rite that everybody walked away from. Substitution is a real and well-attested idea in Mesopotamian ritual. There are rites in which an object or an animal stands in for a person in a dangerous position, most famously in the practice around a substitute king. If the funeral of a ruler required the presence of his household in the underworld, a substitution rite would be a way of achieving that without a single death. Reading 3. A laying out. The household is arranged, ceremonially, in a place for the duration of a funeral. Nobody dies. The verb describes a procession and a positioning that ends when the rite ends. All three are available in the Sumerian. Anybody who tells you the grammar rules out numbers 2 and 3 is going further than the language allows. And anybody who tells you it rules out number 1 has to explain the pits at Ur. So most Assyriologists reading this passage read it next to something else, and the something else is 400 kilometers downriver at Ur, because at Ur the ambiguity is gone. At Ur, we are not reading a verb. We are looking at skeletons. And here are the numbers, and I am going to give you the ones that come from citable, named, published sources. And then I am going to tell you that the counts vary between sources, because they do. The grave Woolley numbered PG 800 is the one he called the Tomb of Queen Pwabi. Her name comes from an object, a cylinder seal of lapis lazuli, now in the British Museum, with the number 1, 21544, inscribed with her name and the title Nin, which is read as Lady or Queen. Peter Roger Stewart Morey, writing in the Penn Museum's magazine Expedition, Volume 20, Number 1, in 1977, gives 2 attendants with the primary burial in the chamber, and 21 further skeletons, mostly female, in the pit outside it. Other summaries of the same grave give a figure closer to 50 attendants. The counts vary. I am telling you, they vary rather than picking the biggest one. The grave Woolley called the King's Grave, PG 789, 63 bodies in the pit, on Maury's 1977 figures, and the one called the Great Death Pit, PG-1 237, 6 male and 68 female, 74 people. That count comes from Maury and is repeated by Aubrey Bodsgard in Expedition, Volume 49, Number 2, in July 2007. Some sources say 73 and 5. Again, the counts vary, and again, I am not going to round upward for effect. 74 people on a floor, in rows. Now, who was Puabi? This is where I have to hand the microphone to the people who disagree. Because there is a real, live, unresolved argument here, and it goes directly to item 5. Woolley read her as a queen. The seal says her name, and it says Nin. She had a chamber, a headdress of gold and lapis and carnelian, attendants, and the full apparatus of a principal burial. But her seal names no king. It names no husband. In a world where a royal woman is very often identified as the wife of somebody, hers simply is not. Some scholars read that as evidence that she held position in her own right, that she was not somebody's queen, but a ruler or a great office holder on her own account. Others read it as entirely normal for the seal of a high priestess, which is Maury's line, that a substantial part of this cemetery may belong not to a secular royal family at all, but to the religious hierarchy of the moon god Nana, whose great temple stood at Ur, and that some of the women Woolley called queens were priestesses. Maury published that in 1977 in the Penn Museum's own magazine, which is to say, the institution that dug the site published the argument against its own most famous interpretation. That is what a healthy discipline looks like, and I want you to notice it happening. And there is one more thing about Puabi's name that I want to give you, because it will inoculate you against a very common bad faith question. For decades, that name was not read as Puabi. It was read as Shubad. If you pick up a book on Ur printed in the 1930s or 40s, you will find Queen Shubad of Ur with photographs in the same tomb with the same seal. The signs did not change. The understanding of how to read them did. Sumerian is written in a script where a single sign can carry several values, and working out which value is intended in which period and which name is decades of patient argument by hundreds of people. So when somebody in the comments asks how we can possibly know what a 4,000-year-old tablet says, the honest answer is not that we are certain. The honest answer is, we were wrong about that queen's name. For about 40 years, we found out we were wrong. We changed it in print. And the fact that you know the old reading at all is because the correction was published. That is not a weakness in the field. That is the field working. A discipline that never revises is a religion, which leaves item 5 sitting exactly where the evidence leaves it. The tablet says his beloved wife was laid down in her place. The verb in Sumerian will bear either a body or a right. And in a cemetery a few days' walk downriver, in roughly the right century, real women really were put into real pits alongside a principal burial, and we have their skulls. That is item 5. And item 6 is the entry that most people slide straight past, and it is the one that broke the formulaic reading for me. Because where item 5 is a single person whose existence in a royal household you would simply assume, item 6 is a plural, and a plural raises a question that the Sumerian king list of all documents answers in a way nobody wants. Item 6. The children. Same source, same line. The Death of Gilgamesh, Nippur version. The section printed in the Oxford Corpus as another version from Nibru, lines 1 to 7, on the manuscripts in Philadelphia and Istanbul, with CBS 6966 at the head of them. Repeated in the Mitterrand manuscripts published by Cavigno and Al-Rawi in the year 2000, at segment H, lines 33 to 41. 3 words in English, quote, his beloved children, end quote. Now, there is another clay object I need to introduce, because it is the only thing in the ancient record that lets us test that line at all. It is a baked clay prism, 4-sided, about 20 centimeters high, and 9 wide, with 2 columns of writing on each face and a hole bored down the middle, so that it could be turned on a spindle. It is in the Ashmolean Museum at the University of Oxford, with the accession number AN1923.444, and its number in the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative is P384786. It is reported to come from Larsa in southern Iraq, and it was acquired in 1922. It is named after Herbert Weld Blundell, the English collector who funded Oxford's Mesopotamian work and gave the prism to the museum, and I want to be precise about that, because you will read that he found it, and I cannot support that. He was a patron. A great deal of the Oxford material of that era was bought rather than dug. The honest phrasing is reported to come from Larsa, acquired in 1922, given by Weld Blundell. It was first published, transcribed, and translated by Stephen Langdon in 1923, and it is the most complete surviving copy of the Sumerian king list. The Sumerian king list is a strange document. It runs the kingship of the land as a single office that moves from city to city, and it hands out reigns of tens of thousands of years to the earliest names and then settles gradually into human numbers as it comes forward. And inside the dynasty of Uruk, in the district of Iana, it says this, quote, Gilgamesh, whose father was a phantom, the lord of Kulaba, ruled for 126 years. Ur-Nungal, the son of Gilgamesh, ruled for 30 years. End quote. Ur-Nungal, the son of Gilgamesh, ruled for 30 years. Now, before I use that line, I have to deal with the first half of it, because it contains a word that this audience will not let me walk past. Whose father was a phantom, with a question mark printed after it by the Oxford editors. The Sumerian word behind that translation is conventionally read as Lilu, a term for a class of spirit or demon, and the same word family that gives the later Akkadian Lilu and Lilitu. The editors put a question mark on it because the reading is genuinely disputed, and I am going to give you all three of the options that appear in the literature rather than picking the most entertaining one. Option 1, it means what the translation says: a spirit, a phantom, a being that is not a living man. On that reading, the king list is telling you that the father of Gilgamesh was not human. Option 2, it is not a supernatural term at all, but a title or a class word applied to a kind of person, an office, a status, or a description of someone's standing. And the demonic sense is a later development of the word that we are reading backwards into an earlier text. Option 3, the entry is corrupt. The king list survives in many copies. They disagree with each other in places. Scribes made mistakes. And this is a garbled line. I do not know which is right. Nobody does, or the question mark would not be there. And here is the collision that you would spot yourself in about 4 seconds. So I would rather hand it to you than have you find it. The king list says his father was a phantom. The Sumerian poems say his father was Lugalbanda, a human king of Uruk, and his mother was the goddess Ninsumen, whom you also see written Ninsen. And the funeral text we are reading tonight calls him, in the gift list passage, the son of Ninsumen, by name. So, the oldest king list we have says his father was not a man, and the oldest poems we have say his father was a man, and both of them are on clay, and both of them were copied by scribes who presumably knew both traditions. They do not agree. Pretending that they do agree, or picking whichever one makes a better video, is exactly the kind of thing that this material does not need any more of. And while I am here, let me kill the other number. The one that is the actual source of every giant story you have ever seen attached to this name. In the standard Babylonian epic, Tablet 1, there is a line about Gilgamesh conventionally transliterated as Shitinshu Iluma Shulul Tashu Amalutu. 2/3 of him God, 1/3 of him human. 2/3. Now, 4 things about that. First, 2/3 is not a possible fraction of ancestry. A son of a goddess and a mortal king is 1/2. 2/3 is not a heredity claim, because heredity cannot produce it. Whatever the line means, it is not a family tree. Second, Mesopotamian arithmetic runs on base 60, and in base 60 2/3 is the single most useful fraction there is. 2/3 is 40 parts of 60. 1/3 is 20 parts of 60. Those are clean, everyday accounting quantities that a Babylonian scribe wrote 100 times a week. And in Mesopotamian inheritance, the preferential share of the eldest son is very often expressed as a double portion, 2 shares against 1, which is why a number of scholars read that famous line not as biology, but as inheritance language. Gilgamesh holds the elder son's share of divinity. That is a statement about status and entitlement in the vocabulary of a will. Third, the line is Akkadian, and it is late. It belongs to the standard Babylonian version, the recension traditionally attributed to a scholar named Sinleki Unini, compiled somewhere between roughly 1300 and 1000 before the Common Era. The older Sumerian poems, including the one we are reading tonight, do not use that formula at all. So 2/3 God is a later theological promotion, not the original claim. And fourth, the BBC repeated it in the 2003 article. It appears there as a photo caption. 2/3 God, 1/3 human. And that caption, sitting under a headline that said a tomb had been found, is a very large part of the reason that a photograph of a fake skeleton has been circulating with his name on it for 20 years. Nothing in that passage gives a height. Nothing anywhere in the epic gives you a giant. The number is almost certainly an accountant's number. Right? Back to the succession, because now the line does its work. Do you see what that does to item 6? If the king list is telling the truth about the succession, and this is the same document that our whole idea of an Uruk dynasty rests on, then at least one of the beloved children of Gilgamesh did not go into that grave because he was sitting on the throne for the next 3 decades, which means the phrase in the funeral text cannot mean all his children. It has to mean either some of them, or a representation of them, or something else again that we have not understood. And that is the mainstream point. And it is a good one. And it is usually deployed as an argument for the formulaic reading. This is a stock phrase, a poetic completion of the household, not a head count. Here is why I think it cuts the other way, at least as strongly. A formula does not have to be internally awkward. If the line were pure boilerplate, the wife, the children, the household, the end, then nothing about it would sit badly against the king list, because nobody reading a formula asks who is missing. The awkwardness only appears when you take the line seriously as a claim about specific people. And when you do take it seriously, what you get is not all of them. You get a selection. Somebody chose. And the moment there is a selection, there is a person doing the choosing, and criteria, and a name that was said, and a name that was not. And here is where the ground at Ur becomes very hard to look at. The population of the death pits is not a random slice of a household. In the Great Death Pit, PG 1237, the figures I gave you a moment ago from Maury in 1977 and Bodsgard in 2007 are 6 men and 68 women. 6 and 68. That is not a household cross-section. That is not what you get if you take a palace and put everyone in it in a hole. That is a chosen group, and the choosing had a rule in it, and the rule had something to do with sex and with age, because Woolley described the great majority of those women as young. And the 6 men are interesting in a different way, because at least one of them, in the king's grave, PG 789, was wearing a copper helmet. That is a soldier. So the group is not homogeneous either. It is overwhelmingly young women, with a small number of armed men, arranged on a floor at the bottom of a shaft. So who were they? And here I have to give you the honest answer first, which is that nobody knows, and then the candidates that serious people have put forward. The first candidate is the household proper, personal attendants, servants, dependents, people whose position in life was defined entirely by proximity to the principal, and whose social existence more or less ended when the principal died. The second is temple personnel. That is Maury's argument from 1977 that I mentioned earlier, that these may be the staff of the cult of the moon god Nana rather than a secular palace. On that reading, a woman in the pit is not a maid. She is clergy. The third is captives, prisoners of war, foreigners, people from outside the community whose deaths cost the community nothing. That is what happens in a number of other cultures that practice this, and it would explain the age profile. And the fourth is the most uncomfortable one, which is a hereditary class of service. People born into a role in which this is the ending, who knew it from childhood, and whose families knew it. That is not a fantasy, It is broadly what the evidence suggests in some of the comparable cases. Nobody has settled it. Isotope work and ancient genetics have the potential to say something about where these people were born, but I am not going to tell you a result I have not read. What I can tell you is that the shape of the group, young, female, graded by ornament, is not the shape of a random tragedy. And I want to say one thing about the graded ornament now because it comes back in a couple of items' time. The jewelry in the pits is not uniform. Some of the women wear elaborate headdresses of gold leaves and lapis and carnelian, and some wear far simpler strings, and there is a range in between. Rank went into the ground with them. Even at the bottom of a shaft, on a floor, in rows, the order of the household was still visible in what people were wearing. Whatever this was, it was not leveling. Now, the last subpoint on item 6, and I am going to keep it factual and short, because it can very easily turn into the wrong kind of entertainment. Retainer burial, the practice of killing or interring members of a household at the death of a ruler, is not a Sumerian eccentricity. It appears independently in Shang, China, where royal tombs contain very large numbers of sacrificed dead. It appears at Kerma in Nubia, where the great tumuli contain corridors of bodies. It appears in Egypt's first dynasty at Abydos, where subsidiary graves surround the royal enclosures, and where it seems to stop. The practice disappears from Egyptian royal burial and does not come back. Different continents, different centuries, no contact between most of them. What that tells you is that this is a thing that a certain kind of early state does, at a certain moment in its formation, and then generally stops doing. It looks like a behavior of very young, very steep hierarchies, where the ruler's household is understood not as a group of employees, but as an extension of his body. And when the body stops, the extension stops. That is a description, not an excuse. 68 young women went onto a floor at Whatever the theory, that is what happened. And it is also why item 6 matters more than its 3 words suggest. The tablet says, his beloved children. The king list says one of his sons ruled for 30 years afterwards. Both of those are written on clay by people who thought they were recording something true, and the only way to hold both is to accept that the funeral involved a choice about which of his own children went into the ground and which did not. There is no version of that sentence that gets easier the longer you look at it. Which takes us to item 7, and item 7 is the entry that most modern readers find hardest to place, because where item 6 was a plural with no individuals in it, item 7 is an individual with no self in her, listed by rank, positioned in the roster below the children of the man she was married to. The source is the Nippur version again, another version from Nebrew, lines 1 to 7, in the Oxford translation of 1.8.1.3. Andrew George gives the same slot in his Penguin edition of 1999 at pages 195 to 208 with a vocabulary of a secondary consort. The words are these, quote, his beloved favorite and junior wife, end quote, favorite and junior, both in the same breath about the same woman in a list that has already named a different woman as the wife. Let me give you the mainstream reading at its full strength, because it does most of the work here, and it is not cynical. It is just accurate. Mesopotamian royal households were formally graded, and the grading was legal and economic rather than romantic. There are distinct Sumerian and Akkadian terms for the principal wife, for a secondary wife, and for a palace woman. Those are not shades of feeling. They are positions, with different property rights, different rights of inheritance for their children, and different standing if the household breaks up. And we know this because the administrative records of Mesopotamian palaces survive in bulk, most famously the archives of Mari on the Middle Euphrates, and much later the temple archives of the Eanna at Uruk itself. And in those archives, the women of a palace appear the way everyone else appears, as names attached to rations. So much barley, so much oil, so much wool, every month. That is what a palace roster actually looks like from the inside. It is a list of mouths, ranked with quantities beside them. When the funeral text recites the household in descending order, wife, children, junior wife, musician, cupbearer, barber, retainers, servants, objects, it is reciting something that a scribe in that building would have written every single month for entirely mundane reasons. That is a serious argument, and it goes a long way. The list is a payroll. And I want to give you a feel for what those archives are actually like. Because when I say ration lists, it sounds thin. And the reality is one of the most extraordinary bodies of evidence from the ancient world. Mesopotamian palaces and temples wrote down almost everything on clay, and clay does not burn. When a building was destroyed by fire, which is how a great many of these archives come to us, the tablets in it were baked hard by the same fire that killed the archive's owners, and they survive better than anything else in the ruin. So what we have from these places is not a summary or a chronicle. It is the working paperwork, receipts, deliveries, loans, contracts, letters between officials complaining about each other, lists of people with quantities beside their names, month after month. And in those lists, the women of a palace appear exactly as the men do, as a name, a designation, and an allocation of barley and oil and wool, ranked. Different quantities for different positions. A woman of high standing draws more than a woman of low standing, and the difference is written down by a clerk who had no interest whatsoever in her inner life. That is the document behind our poem. When the funeral text recites wife, children, junior wife, musician, cupbearer, barber, retainers, servants, it is reciting the same sequence in the same order that some scribe in some storeroom wrote out on the first of the month, every month, for years, so that the right amount of grain went to the right doorway. Which is why the roster feels administrative when you read it. It feels administrative because it is. And now the thing that will not sit still. Every entry on that payroll carries the same adjective: his beloved wife, his beloved children, his beloved favorite and junior wife, his beloved musician, his beloved barber, his beloved palace retainers and servants. And we will get to this, and it is the sentence that changed how I read the whole text. His beloved objects. The Sumerian behind it is the word conventionally read kiang, which is the ordinary Sumerian way of saying beloved. And it is on everything. I have thought about this for a long time, and I do not think the adjective is decorative. Decorative adjectives get varied. A poet who wanted the passage to sound rich would reach for a different word by the third entry. This one repeats mechanically down the whole roster, including onto the furniture, which means one of two things. Either it is an administrative marker, a formal designation, something like of the king's own establishment, in which case the tenderness we hear in it is entirely our import, and we should stop hearing it. Or it means what it says, and the text is doing something genuinely strange, reciting an inventory of the people a man loved as the reason they had to be put in the ground with him. I cannot prove which, but I can tell you that the second reading is not a modern sentimentality laid over an ancient document. It is the sentence. The same word governs the wife and the goods, and either that flattens the people, or it elevates the objects, and either way, the text is not doing what we would do. Now the guardrail, and I am going to state it plainly, because this is exactly the point in a video like this, where somebody starts inventing. I am not going to tell you what she looked like. I am not going to tell you what she wore, how old she was, whether she went willingly, whether she loved him, whether she had children, what she felt on the last morning. The text gives me a rank and an adjective. That is the entire holding. Everything else that you have ever heard about the women in this story is somebody's fiction, and most of it is recent fiction, and I would rather leave the space empty and let you feel the emptiness than fill it with something warm and false. What I can put beside her is the archaeology, and the archaeology at has one detail that speaks directly to a graded household. Look again at the ornaments in the pits. They are not uniform, and the variation is not random. Some of the women in the Great Death Pit wear gold, some wear silver, some wear a headdress with the full arrangement of leaves and rings and beads and combs, and some wear a single strand. The kit corresponds to position, which means that at the moment these people were arranged on that floor, and we are going to see in a few items that arranged may be exactly the right word. Somebody knew each one's rank, and dressed her to it, and placed her accordingly. That is what makes the junior wife entry real to me, rather than literary. The poem gives you a household in which every person has a precise place, and the ground at gives you a floor on which every person has a precise place, and both of them survive by accident. One because 6 pieces of a broken tablet ended up in the same museum drawer in Philadelphia, and the other because a man with a trowel and a great deal of patience went 10 meters down at Ur in the 1920s. And then there is Puabi again, standing slightly outside all of it, because her seal names no husband at all. If the Ur cemetery were simply a set of royal households in the pattern the Uruk poem describes, you would expect the principal woman to be identified in relation to a man. She is not. She is named and titled and buried with her own attendants, and nothing on the object connects her to anybody. Some scholars take that as evidence that she held her office in her own right. Others take it as ordinary for a priestess. That argument has been running since Maury put it in print in 1977, and it has not been settled. So the honest summary of item 7 is this. The tablet lists a second-ranked wife, separately below the children, with the same word of affection attached to her as to everyone and everything else on the list. Mesopotamian palaces really did rank their women that way, and we know it from ration lists. And at Ur, the graded ornament on the bodies in the pits shows that the ranking followed people down the ramp. Which brings us to item 8. And if item 7 is the entry where the text gives you a rank and refuses you a person, item 8 is the exact reverse. Item 8 is the entry where the poem names a job, and the ground hands you the object that job was done with, lying next to a human being. Item 8. The musician. The source is the Nippur version, the section the Oxford Corpus prints as another version from Nibru, lines 1 to 7, on the Nippur manuscripts. CBS 6966 and its joins, CDLI number P264388, in a drawer in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia, along with the other Nippur witnesses there, and in Istanbul. The translation is the Oxford 1.8.1.3 by Black, Cunningham, Robson, and Zolyomi. Here is the line, with its hole in it. Quote, his beloved musician, cupbearer, and ... End quote. A musician, not a name, a profession. Now, in every other item tonight, I have given you the mainstream reading, and then a counter reading, and I have tried to make the mainstream case as strong as I can make it. I am not going to do that here, because on this one, there is nothing to argue with. This is the entry where the poem and the ground touch, hard, and they touch on the same object. Between 1922 and 1934, at Ur, Leonard Woolley found lyres in the death pits. Not in a storeroom, not in a temple. In the pits, on the floor, with human remains beside them. The Ur lyres are among the oldest surviving stringed instruments on Earth. There is the one called the Queen's lyre, and the one usually called the golden lyre, or the bull-headed lyre, and the one called the silver lyre, and fragments of others. They are built the way everything else in that cemetery is built, a wooden body, long since rotted to nothing, sheathed and inlaid with the materials that survive. Gold, silver, shell, lapis lazuli, bitumen holding it together. The great ones carry the head of a bull at the front of the soundbox, modeled in gold or silver over a wooden core, with a beard of lapis, and eyes of shell and lapis staring straight out at you. And this is where I have to remind you what I told you back at item 3, because it applies here more than anywhere. The wood was gone. Completely gone. What Woolley had in the ground was a cavity in the earth with a scatter of gold and shell and stone lying in and around it in the exact positions those pieces had occupied when the wood underneath them was still wood. His answer was to pour plaster into the void, let it set, and lift out a cast of an instrument that had not physically existed for 4,500 years. The shape of the lyre is a modern shape, filling an ancient absence. The decoration is original. Think about what that means for a second. A man knelt in the dirt at the bottom of a shaft, poured liquid plaster into a hole shaped like music, and waited for it to go off. And one of the pits those instruments came out of is PG-1237, the Great Death Pit, the same grave that produced the gold and lapis goat we call the ram in a thicket, the same grave with 6 men and 68 women on its floor. So the sequence is this. A Sumerian poem, written down in the Old Babylonian period, copied at Nippur, says that a musician was among the household put into a king's grave. And a British excavation at a different Sumerian city, several centuries earlier in date, digging without any interest in that poem, finds musical instruments lying on the floors of burial pits, among rows of dead people. The text names the office, The ground produced the instrument. Somebody was holding it. Now let me tell you what a Sumerian court musician actually was, because our word musician is a bad translation of the position, and it makes the entry sound decorative. The Sumerian office, usually rendered as musician, is written nar. A nar is not an entertainer. A nar is a member of a professional body attached to a temple or a palace, and the work is liturgical as much as it is artistic. Performance at rites, at offerings, at festivals, at royal occasions. There is a second and stranger office alongside it, the gala, associated particularly with lamentation, the professional performance of grief in a specific dialect of Sumerian, for the temple and for the dead. These are not busking jobs. They are trained, salaried, ranked positions in a religious establishment, and the people who held them appear in exactly the same ration lists as everybody else. Which means the presence of a musician in a funerary roster is not there, because somebody thought a king should have nice sounds in the afterlife. It is there because a rite has personnel, and the personnel of a rite are as necessary to it as the cups. And that, in turn, is the strongest reason to believe that the household list in this poem is copied from something administrative, rather than invented for effect. It has the right jobs in it. It has the jobs an actual palace had. Let me stay with the instruments a moment longer, because there are two details about them that matter. The first is the bull. The head on the front of the great lyre is not decoration in our sense. The bull is one of the standard bearers of divine and royal power in this world, and the soundbox of a lyre is, physically, a resonating body with a voice. So the object is built as an animal that speaks. The strings run over the body of a bull, and the noise comes out of it. Whatever these instruments were used for, they were not conceived as neutral tools. The second is that we can reconstruct a fair amount about how they were strung and tuned, because Mesopotamian scribes wrote about tuning. There are cuneiform texts dealing with the strings of instruments and the relations between them, which is one of the reasons people can now build reconstructions and play them. We are not entirely guessing about the sound, and I want to say what music was actually doing in that world, because we tend to file it under pleasure, and that is not where it sat. A great deal of Mesopotamian musical performance is liturgical. It accompanies offerings. It accompanies processions. It is how a rite is timed, and how a crowd is held together. And there is a whole class of composition, associated particularly with the lamentation singers, whose function is the formal performance of grief, over a dead person, over a ruined city, over a temple that has been destroyed. Those laments are among the most affecting texts to survive from Mesopotamia, and they are professional work, written to a form, performed by people who trained for it, which means that a musician at a royal funeral is not there as an accompaniment. The musician is part of the machinery of the event, in the same way the priest is. The rite requires sound. Somebody has to make it. And now, hold the two facts together, because the sequence is unbearable when you say it in one breath. In the graves at Ur, the instruments were in the pits, which means either the music was played down there and then the players stayed, or the instruments were carried down and laid out after everything was over. Woolley's reading was the first. The procession goes down, the sound continues, and then it stops. There is no way to write that sentence that makes it easier. And now, the third subpoint, which I am going to handle with more care than usual because I could not source it properly. In April of 2003, the Iraq Museum in Baghdad was looted. That much is completely uncontested, and it is one of the worst cultural losses of my lifetime. The Warq of As, one of the great objects of world archaeology and a product of Uruk itself, was taken and then returned on the 12th of June, 2003, broken. The mask of Warqa was recovered in September of the same year. Ur material was in that building, because the finds from Woolley's excavation were divided three ways between the Iraq Museum in Baghdad, the British Museum in London, and the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. You will very often read that a lyre from Ur was damaged in that looting. I have seen it retold in many places. I could not confirm from a source I trust which instrument it was or how badly it was harmed, and so I am going to leave it exactly there. The museum was looted, Ur material was in the museum, and I am not going to give you a detail I cannot stand behind. If you know the reference, put it in the comments with the citation, and I will pin it. But I want you to hold the shape of that anyway, because it rhymes with the whole evening. The German team's survey at Uruk stopped because of that war. The museum that held a third of the Ur finds was emptied because of that war. And the reason the tomb in the riverbed was never dug is that same war. One year, 2003, produced a headline about a grave, a looted museum, and a 13-year gap in the excavation. It is the single most consequential year in this story, and nothing good happened in it. And here is the line I want to leave item 8 on. We have the instrument. We have it in gold and shell and lapis in 3 museums on 2 continents, reconstructed out of a hole in the ground by a man pouring plaster. We can describe how it was strung. We can, within limits, tune it. We do not have the player. We have no name. We have no age. We do not know whether she was a Nar or a Gala, whether she was from Ur or from somewhere else, whether she went down the ramp on her own feet. 4,500 years later, the most that any document on earth can call her is his beloved musician. We saved the instrument, and we lost the person. That is not a Sumerian failure. That is ours. Let me put the first 8 in a line, because the second half of this list is where it stops being about a household and starts being about the gods. And I want the whole chain in your head before we cross that line. 1. A river, dammed and pushed aside so that the grave could be built in its dry bed and the water put back on top of it. 2. Stone in a country with none, itemized down to the bolt, the thresholds, the door pivots, and the latches, with hard diorite named. 3. Gold, almost certainly leaf over wood and bitumen, the technique Woolley actually excavated at Ur, and the reason graves get robbed. 4. A thick layer of dark soil and a broken instruction that searchers should not find the place, followed by a second public building raised in the middle of the city. 5. His beloved wife, with no name given anywhere in the text. 6. His beloved children, plural, against a king list that says his son Ur-Nungal ruled for the next 30 years, which means somebody chose which children went in. 7. His beloved favorite and junior wife, a formally ranked position in a household we know from ration lists, carrying the same word of affection as everyone else on the roster. And 8. His beloved musician, an office that really existed, whose instrument Woolley lifted out of a death pit at Ur as a plaster cast of an empty space. 8 down, 4 to go, and the last one is the one the title is about. If this is the kind of thing you want more of, slow, sourced, and willing to tell you when the clay is broken, subscribe, because the next one in this series goes further into the same material and you will not see it unless you do. And tell me in the comments whether you think anyone will ever put a spade into that riverbed. I genuinely do not know the answer, and I would like to read yours. Now, item 9. Item 8 was the entry where the poem and the ground agreed with each other perfectly, and I said there was nothing to argue with. Item 9 is the exact opposite. Item 9 is a single small object that has been argued about for 90 years, and in the last 15, the argument has changed sides. And the object is a cup. The source is the same line I read you a moment ago, from the Nippur version. Another version from Nebrew, lines 1 to 7, in the Oxford translation. Quote, his beloved musician, cupbearer, and ... End quote. The cupbearer. In a royal household, the cupbearer is a serious office. The person who handles what the king drinks is by definition a person trusted with the king's life, and in several Near Eastern courts, the title turns up attached to men of considerable power. But that is not why this entry is the hinge of the whole video. It is the hinge because of what Woolley found lying beside the bodies at Ur. Small clay cups. Plain ones. Beside the dead, on the floor of the pits. One to a person or thereabouts. And out of those cups, Woolley built the interpretation that has stood for the better part of a century, and that you have almost certainly heard, whether or not you knew where it came from. Here is his reading, and I am going to give it at full strength, because it is not stupid, it is careful, and in 1928, it was the best available account of what he was looking at. The pit is open, the ramp leads down into it, the principal is placed in the chamber, and then the household walks down the ramp in procession in their ornaments, carrying their instruments and their tools, dressed for it. Each of them takes a cup. In the cup is a drug or a poison. They drink. They lie down in their rows, in order, and they die. and afterwards the chamber is sealed, and the pit is filled, and the whole thing was, if not exactly voluntary, at least something the participants walked into on their own legs. That reading is on museum labels all over the world. It was stated as the received account in the Penn Museum's own magazine, Expedition, by Aubrey Bodsgard, in volume 49, number 2. In July of 2007, that they were put to death by drinking poison from small clay cups. It is the reason the word most often attached to these people is willingly, and the reason Woolley reached it is straightforward and worth respecting. The bodies were in order, in their finery, with no sign of a struggle, and there were cups. If you are standing in that pit in 1928, with no scanner and no laboratory and a rapidly deteriorating set of bones, self-administered poison is not a wild guess. It is the only story that fits everything you can see with your eyes. Now here is what happened 80 years later, and it is peer-reviewed, and it changes the picture. Out of the thousands of bodies excavated at Ur, only 6 crushed skulls survive in a condition that can be examined. 6. That is the sample, and I am telling you the size of it before I tell you the result, because the size of it is the honest limitation. On the 15th of April, 2007, 2 of those 6 skulls were taken from the Penn Museum to the hospital of the University of Pennsylvania and put through a CT scanner. One was Body 53 from PG 1237, the Great Death Pit, a young woman, her skull crushed and preserved in 3/4 profile, still covered in her gold and her lapis. The other was a male from PG 789, the King's Grave, still wearing a crushed copper helmet, probably a soldier. The work was led by Aubrey Bodsgard with the Penn Museum's physical anthropology staff and with Richard Zettler. The results were published as Human Sacrifice and Intentional Corpse Preservation in the Royal Cemetery of Ur by Bodsgard, Monge, Cox, and Zettler in the journal Antiquity, volume 85, number 327, in 2011, pages 27 to 42. 2 things came out of those scans. The first was cranial trauma, not the kind of crushing you get from 4,000 years of earth pressing down on a skull. That happens, and it is recognizable, and it is why the skulls are flattened at all. This was perimortem injury, consistent with a blow from a sharp, heavy instrument, in a location, and of a kind that is not consistent with somebody quietly falling asleep after drinking from a cup. The second was stranger. The scans showed a radio-opaque residue, something dense, probably metallic, dusted around the skulls in a halo. The author's reading of it is that it is most likely mercury sulfide, cinnabar, which is a known preservative in the ancient world, used on bodies, and which does not get onto a skull by accident. And the reconstruction they proposed from that is not a small adjustment to Woolley. It is a different event. Their sequence, the victims were felled with a sharp instrument, heated, embalmed with mercury, dressed, and laid ceremonially in rows. Heated. That word had already been floated in the 2007 Expedition article, and it is the one that does the most damage to the old picture, because if bodies were heated and treated before burial, then they did not die in that pit. They died somewhere else. They were prepared somewhere else, and then they were carried down and arranged, which means the floor of the Great Death Pit is not a death scene at all. It is a display. The author's own phrase for what replaces Woolley's procession is worth quoting exactly, because it is the most restrained and the most devastating sentence in the paper. A procedure, they write, no less chilling, but more enforceable. Enforceable. Sit with that word for a moment. Woolley's dead consented, or half consented, and the horror of it was the horror of a belief so strong that people would walk down a ramp for it. The 2011 reading takes the consent out and puts a person with an implement in its place. Somebody made sure. And then somebody cleaned them, dressed them, and set them out in rows so that the thing would look like the first story. Now, I said at the start of this video that I would hand the microphone to the skeptics wherever there is a genuine disagreement, and I am not going to resolve this one for you because it is not resolved. Here's what stands against the new reading. 2 skulls, out of 6 that survive, out of thousands of people. That is a very small window, and both of the individuals examined are unusual. One is a helmeted man, probably a soldier, and one is a woman whose skull happened to preserve. A finding on 2 individuals cannot tell you what happened to 72 others in the same pit, let alone to the hundreds elsewhere in the cemetery. It is entirely possible that the picture is mixed, that some of these deaths were what Woolley thought, and some were what the scanner found. And here is what stands against the old reading. Woolley never had any physical evidence of poison. He had cups. He inferred a substance from a container, and the inference is a good one, and it is still an inference. Nobody has ever found a residue in one of those cups and identified it. The cup is the whole basis of the willingly. And I want to spend one more minute on the word willingly, because it is the word that does the most damage in both directions. When people say the retainers went willingly, they usually mean something like, these people believed, and their belief was strong enough that they walked into a grave for it. And that is a real thing that human beings do, and there is nothing implausible about it. Belief of that intensity is well attested in 100 contexts, and it does not require anyone to be stupid or coerced. But look at what has to be true for willingly to mean anything at all in this setting. It has to be possible to refuse, and I want you to try to construct the refusal. You are a young woman in the household of the ruler of Ur in about 2500 before the Common Era. Your position, your food, your housing, your standing, and your family's standing all come from that household. The ruler has died. Preparations are being made. Everyone around you is being dressed. What, precisely, is the procedure by which you decline? There may have been one. I do not know that there was not. But any sentence that begins they chose is doing a lot of quiet work that nobody has ever justified with evidence. That is why the 2011 paper's word is so effective. Enforceable. It does not say the participants were unwilling. It says the procedure did not depend on their willingness. Those are different claims, and the second one is much harder to argue with. Now, a fair objection to the new reading, which I want on the record because it is the one I would raise. Cranial trauma in an archaeological skull is a difficult thing to interpret, and specialists argue about it constantly. Bone that has been in the ground for 4,000 years under the weight of a filled shaft breaks, and telling apart a break that happened around the time of death from a break that happened centuries later is a technical judgment, not a photograph. The authors of the 2011 paper are aware of that. It is the central problem of their own field, and their argument rests on the pattern of fracture and on the state of the bone, and on the residue, and on all of it together, rather than on any single feature. It is a good argument. It is not a confession. And there is a second thing that keeps me from closing this. Nobody has ever found a poison. Nobody has ever ruled one out either. The cup is still the whole basis of the older story, and it is still empty. What I keep coming back to is the object. Woolley had a cup. He built a procession out of a cup, and it was the best reading available, and it held for 80 years, and it may still be partly right. A great excavator's guesses become the vocabulary of a discipline, and then the vocabulary becomes the picture in everybody's head, and it takes a hospital scanner and 80 years to get a second opinion. So the honest state of item 9 is this. The tablet says a cupbearer went into the grave of Gilgamesh. In the graves at Ur, a cup was found beside body after body. For 80 years, that cup was read as the instrument of a chosen death. In 2011, 2 skulls in a hospital scanner in Philadelphia produced trauma and a metallic halo, and the people who published it used the word enforceable, and the cup, the small, plain, everyday clay cup, is still lying there in both stories. In one of them, it is the last thing a person chose to pick up. In the other, it is a prop. That is item 9, and it takes us to item 10, which is the entry I would have expected any inventor to leave out. Because where item 9 gives you a high office of the palace, a title that turns up attached to powerful men across the Near East, item 10 gives you a job so ordinary, so domestic, and so completely unheroic that its presence on this list is, to me, the single strongest argument that somebody copied it off something real. Item 10. The Barber. Source. The Nippur version of the Death of Gilgamesh, the section printed in the Oxford Corpus as another version from Nibru, lines 1 to 7. The manuscripts are the Nippur witnesses in the Pen Museum and in Istanbul, headed by CBS 6966, with its 5 joined fragments, CDLIP 264388. The Oxford translation 1.8.1.3. the line, with its hole. Quote, his beloved barber, his beloved ... End quote. The barber. I want you to sit with how completely unromantic that is. We have just come through a river diverted from its bed, a chamber of imported stone, gold beams, a concealed precinct, a wife, children, a second wife, a musician, and a cupbearer. And the next entry on the list of things put into the grave of the most famous king in the literature of the ancient world is the man who cut his hair. Now, the mainstream reading, and it is entirely correct, and it makes the entry more interesting rather than less. The barber is a real Mesopotamian office. The Sumerian is written Shui. The Akkadian is Galabu. It is attested across the whole span of Mesopotamian history, in palaces, in temples, and in ordinary town life, and it is a trade with an apprenticeship and a professional identity. And the job is much larger than the modern word suggests. A Mesopotamian barber shaved. That sounds trivial until you understand that several classes of priest were required to be depilated for reasons of ritual purity. The priestly office we will meet in item 12 as the gudu, the purification priest, is conventionally understood to have been shaven, which means the man with the razor is a functional part of the machinery of the temple. Without him, the rite cannot proceed because the personnel cannot be made clean. He cut and dressed hair, which in a court where hairstyle is rank is not cosmetic work, it is the maintenance of visible status. He carried out minor surgery in some periods. The boundary between the barber and the man who lances and stitches is thin in most pre-modern societies, and it was thin here. And in some periods and places, the barber is the person who applied marks to slaves. The same hand, the same blade. So this is a skilled trade with a blade, standing at the intersection of purity, rank, medicine, and ownership. It is not a small job. And I want to say something about hair, because we have almost completely lost the sense of what it meant. In Mesopotamian art, you can read a person's position off their head. Look at the sculpture and the inlay and the seals and you will see it. The long, elaborately dressed beards of rulers and gods, curled and squared and combed into registers. The shaven skulls of certain priests, smooth and bare in a world where nobody else is. The arranged hair of the women in the banquet scenes. The cropped heads of prisoners and of workmen. Hair is a uniform. It tells you who somebody is from 30 paces, which in a city of 40,000 people with no other identification is not a trivial function. Which means the man who cuts it is the man who maintains the visible order of the household. He is not making people look nice. He is keeping the ranks legible. And there is a harder edge to it, which is that the same skill that marks status can remove it. Shaving is also what you do to somebody to strip them of office, of standing, of freedom. The barber's blade builds the hierarchy, and it also erases people from it. And in some periods, the same hand that trimmed the king's beard cut the mark into a slave. One trade, both ends of the ladder. So when this list gets to the barber, it is not stepping down into triviality. It is naming the person who handled the surface on which the entire household's rank was written. Now the counter reading, which is really an argument about what kind of document this list is. Nobody inventing a heroic funeral puts the barber in it. Think about how a made-up royal burial reads. You put in the queen. You put in the general, because a hero needs a war. You put in the high priest, because a hero needs a god. You put in horses and chariots and weapons and the treasure of the city. Those are the pieces that a storyteller reaches for, because they carry the meaning the story wants. Nobody reaches for the barber. The barber does not signify anything. The barber cannot be made to stand for the reach of the kingdom or the favor of the gods. He is on this list for one reason, which is that he was on the list the scribe was copying from. And the list the scribe was copying from was a household roster, of the kind that gets written when somebody has to work out how much barley goes out this month. That is the whole argument for item 10, and I think it is the strongest structural argument in the video. The presence of the boring entry is the evidence, and there is a second half to it, which is about proximity. Of every person on this roster, the barber is the one who is physically closest to the king's body, most often with the least protection. The wife shares a room. The cupbearer handles what goes into his mouth, but the barber stands behind him every few days with a blade at his throat, and the king sits still and closes his eyes and lets him. That is not a job you give to a stranger. That is a job you give to someone whose family you know, whose loyalty you have tested, who has been in the building for 20 years, which is exactly the kind of person who ends up on the wrong list when the king dies. The most trusted are the most bound. Proximity is the thing that saves you in life, and the thing that takes you down the ramp. Now, let me put the ground beside it, the way I have with every other item, and here the match is small, but it is real. Among the objects that came out of the graves at Ur are personal kits, pins, tweezers, small implements, cosmetic tools, containers for pigment and for oil, the sort of assemblage that gets called a toilet set in the older excavation reports. They were found with bodies, not in a workshop somewhere, with the dead, as part of what went down with a person. So the poem names a profession whose work is the maintenance of the body, and the cemetery hands you the implements for the maintenance of the body, lying next to people. As with the lyre, I cannot walk you from one to the other and tell you the tweezers belonged to a barber. What I can tell you is that the categories match. This is a culture that considered the care of the surface of a person to be important enough to bury. And now, the subpoint that I think is the most important thing in this entire item, and possibly the most important thing in the second half of this video. Look at the line again. Quote, his beloved barber, his beloved ... End quote. And look at the line before it. Quote, his beloved musician, cupbearer, and ... End quote. There are two ellipses. Two professions were listed on that tablet, in that roster, in the same grammar as the wife and the musician and the barber. And the clay is broken where their names were. The words are gone, not disputed, not uncertain in reading. Gone. There is nothing there. Two of the things buried with Gilgamesh, according to the tablet, are missing from the tablet. I have spent this whole video telling you where the text is broken, and I have been doing it partly out of principle, and partly because I wanted you to arrive at this moment, already trusting the dots. Because here they are not a nuisance. Here they are the thing itself. Somebody wrote down the complete roster of a royal household, and the physical object carrying it spent 3,000 or 4,000 years in the ground at Nafar, and then somebody dug it up in the 1890s and shipped it to Philadelphia in pieces. And in the pieces that survive, there are two holes where two people used to be. And I want to say clearly what kind of loss that is, because it is a different kind from most of the losses in this video. A broken line in a poem is usually recoverable in the end. Another copy turns up, or a parallel passage tells you what the phrase must have been. That is how a great deal of this literature has been reassembled, not from one perfect tablet, but from a dozen damaged ones, laid side by side, each filling the other's holes. And that is what our anchor tablet physically is, because I have been saying 6 fragments all evening, as though that were a small thing, and it is not. The 6 pieces carry 6 separate numbers, given at 6 separate moments by 6 separate hands. CBS 06966, CBS 07900, CBS 14109B, and 3 more with N numbers, N1377, N3189, N3190. They came out of the mound at Nuffer during Pennsylvania's campaigns between 1889 and 1900, and they were cataloged as what they appeared to be: 6 unrelated scraps of broken clay, among tens of thousands of others, in a collection too large for anyone to hold in their head. Now, how do you find out that 2 scraps in 2 different drawers are the same tablet? It is called making a join, and it is done by hand and by eye. You look at the break itself, because a break in clay has a surface with a shape, and 2 pieces that were once one piece fit each other and nothing else. You look at the curvature, because a tablet is not flat, it swells, and the swell of a fragment tells you roughly where on the tablet it sat. You look at the thickness, the color, the temper of the clay, and the ruled lines the scribe drew, and whether they run on across the break at the right spacing. And above all, you look at the signs, because a wedge that has been cut in half by a break will only complete itself in one way. And if the last half sign on one fragment and the first half sign on another make a real word in a real line of a known composition, you have it. That is patient work, done by people leaning over trays under a lamp, and it took 100 years on this object. Edward Shira published the first of it in 1934 in Sumerian epics and myths and Sumerian texts of varied contents. Samuel Noah Kramer produced the first critical edition and translation of the composition in the Bulletin of the American Schools of Oriental Research, number 94, in 1944. And the joins kept coming long after both men were dead. Nick Veldhuis published the join of CBS 14109b in the Journal of Cuneiform Studies, volume 53, page 146, and Jeremiah Peterson published the join of N1377 in the series Biblioteca del Próximo Oriente Antiguo, volume 9, page 69. So think about what the inventory we have been reading tonight actually is, as a physical thing. It is wreckage. It was smashed at some point nobody recorded. It lay in the dirt of a dead city for 3,000 or 4,000 years. It was dug up in 6 separate acts by workmen who had no idea the pieces belonged together. It crossed an ocean. And then it sat in 6 drawers in Philadelphia for decades while people walked past it. The receipt for the grave had to be reassembled from rubble before anyone on earth could read what was on it. And 2 lines of it still cannot be read, because those pieces have not turned up, which is a different kind of loss again. A name in a list has no parallel to be recovered from. There is no meter pushing it into place. Nothing else in the composition tells you which 2 offices stood there. If every other manuscript is broken at the same point, and the surviving ones are damaged, and they are damaged in overlapping places, then those 2 words are simply gone, and no amount of scholarship recovers them. We have a receipt. 2 lines of the receipt have worn away, and nobody alive will ever know what those 2 lines said unless another manuscript of this composition comes out of the ground, which is not impossible, because 10 of them have already, and one of them turned up in a rescue excavation in the Diyala in the 1980s, 3 years before the site went under a reservoir. Now, can I guess what was in the gaps? I can tell you what a Sumerian palace roster generally contains, and I am going to label that inference clearly, because it is inference and not text. The administrative records give us cooks and brewers and bakers, gatekeepers, scribes, stewards, weavers, laundrymen, chariot drivers and animal handlers, singers and lamentation priests, and a long tail of dependents. Any of those would fit the meter and the grammar. Several of them would fit the pattern of the list, which so far has moved from family to household intimates to service. But I am not going to pick 2 and hand them to you, because in 6 months, somebody would be quoting me, and the quote would have my 2 guesses in it with the dots removed, and by next year it would be on 100 pages as a fact. That is exactly how the giant photograph happened. I would rather leave the hole open. So item 10 is the barber, a real office with a razor and a place in the purity machinery of the temple, the least glamorous name on a list of glamorous things, present for no reason except that he was really there, and beside him, 2 of the 12, lost to the clay. And that takes us to item 11, which is where the poem stops naming individuals altogether. Item 10 gave you 1 man, so specific that you can almost see the kit in his hands. Item 11 gives you everybody who is left, in a single sweep, in 1 sentence, and then, in the same sentence, without so much as a pause for breath, it gives you the furniture. The source is the Nippur version again, another version from Nebrew, lines 1 to 7, Oxford translation 1.8.1.3, the manuscripts in Philadelphia and Istanbul, CBS 6966 at the head of them. Here is the closing of the roster, verbatim, quote, "His beloved palace retainers and servants and his beloved objects were laid down in their places as if ... in the purified ... palace in the middle of Unug." End quote. I am going to read the important part of that twice, once at speed, the way a scribe would rattle off a closing formula, and once slowly. At speed, his beloved palace, retainers, and servants, and his beloved objects were laid down in their places. Now, slowly, his beloved palace retainers, and servants, and his beloved objects were laid down in their places. 1 sentence, 1 verb, 1 adjective, applied identically to the human beings and to the things. There is no change of register between the servants and the objects. There is no marker separating the animate from the inanimate. Whoever wrote that sentence put people and property inside the same clause and governed both with the same word for beloved and the same verb for laying down. I want to be very careful here, because it would be easy and cheap to say that Sumerians did not distinguish between people and things. That is false. Sumerian law and Sumerian administration distinguish constantly, in detail, with different terms and different consequences. This is a culture with elaborate ideas about persons. What I am pointing at is narrower and stranger. In this specific sentence, at this specific moment, the moment of the burial, the distinction is not being made, and I do not think that is a slip. I think it is what a funerary roster is. At the point where a household goes into the ground, everything in the household is being described by the same operation. It is being placed. The servant is placed. The chair is placed. The lyre is placed. What defines all of them in that instant is that they belong to him and that they are going where he goes. The mainstream account of this is simply that it is inventory grammar, and that is right, and it does not soften anything. A scribe closing a list puts the ranked individuals first and then sweeps up the remainder into categories: retainers and servants, then goods, unenumerated. It is how every list in every archive ends, from Sumer to the present. The composite category is the sound of somebody finishing. It is inventory grammar. That is my point. It is inventory grammar, and there are people in it. Now, the numbers, and I want to put these in your ear as counts of human beings, and not as statistics. At Woolley excavated roughly 1,850 graves in the initial count, with about another 260 identified afterwards. Call it 2,100 burials altogether. Out of that, 16 were classed as royal tombs, and I have already told you that the classification is partly circular because the presence of household dead is built into the definition. In the grave he called the king's grave, PG 78963. In the grave of Pwabi, PG 800, 2 with her in the chamber and 21 outside it, on Maury's 1977 figures, with other sources giving higher counts. In the Great Death Pit, PG 1 237 74, 6 men, 68 women. There are others, PG 1054, attributed to a woman sometimes called Nabanda, PG 1050, and PG 779, which is the grave that produced the object we call the Standard of Ur. The date on all of it is early Dynastic 3A, around 2600 to 2450, before the Common Era. The excavation was funded jointly by the British Museum and the University of Pennsylvania Museum, and the finds were divided 3 ways: Baghdad, London, Philadelphia. That division is why, when the Iraq Museum was looted in 2003, part of Woolley's was in the building. 63, 74, 21. Those are floors of people. Let me make one of them concrete, because a number is a way of not looking at something. The Great Death Pit is a rectangular cut in the ground, reached by a sloping ramp. At the bottom, on the floor, Woolley recorded the bodies in rows: 6 men and 68 women. Against one wall, the lyres, with the bones of people beside them, and the whole of it covered by fill, and then by the accumulated centuries of a city dying above it. 74 people in one hole from one event in one afternoon or one day or 1 week. We do not know how long the arrangement took, and if the 2011 reading is right, some of it happened elsewhere and over a longer period than a single ceremony. And I want to be precise about what the arrangement looked like, because this is where your own argument lives, and you deserve details to argue with rather than a summary. They were not thrown in. That's the first and most important thing, and nobody disputes it. The bodies lay in rows, in a repeated posture, in an order, and they were dressed. Not stripped, not shrouded, but wearing what they wore in life: the gold and the silver, and the lapis and the carnelian, the headdresses of leaves and rings and beads, the pins, the combs. The men who had weapons had them. The women with the elaborate kit had the elaborate kit, and the women with a plain string of beads had a plain string of beads, and both were in the same hole at the same moment. Rank was still legible on the floor, and beside them, the cups, small, plain, clay, one to a person, or near enough. So what does that arrangement license us to say? And what does it not? It licenses this much. Whatever happened was planned, ordered, and unhurried. There is no scatter, no defensive posture, no sign of anyone having been dragged. Somebody knew where each person was to be placed before the placing started, and knew each person's rank well enough to dress them to it. That is not in dispute in any version of this argument. What it does not license is the next sentence, and the next sentence is the one everybody wants to write. It does not tell you whether the people in those rows arranged themselves. Composure in a burial is not evidence of consent, because composure can be arranged afterwards. A body laid out neatly tells you about the person who did the laying out. It does not tell you about the last hour of the person laid out. Woolley read the order as the trace of a procession, because in 1928, the order was the only evidence there was. But the order is equally consistent with a scene composed by other hands afterwards. Which is where the 2011 work sits, and I am going to give you the limitation before the finding, because that is the honest sequence. Out of thousands of people excavated at Ur, 6 crushed skulls survive in examinable condition. 2 of those 6 were scanned at the Hospital of the University of Pennsylvania on the 15th of April, 2007, body 53 from the Great Death Pit, and a helmeted male from the King's Grave. 2 out of 6 that survive out of thousands. That is the sample. Everything that follows rests on it. On those 2, the scans showed cranial trauma inconsistent with poisoning and a dense residue haloing the skulls that the authors read as most likely cinnabar. Bodsgaard, Monge, Cox, and Zettler in Antiquity, Volume 85, Number 327, 2011. 2 skulls cannot tell you what happened to 72 other people on the same floor. They can tell you that something happened at Ur that Woolley's account does not cover. Both sentences are true at once, and I am not going to collapse them into one for you, because the field has not collapsed them either. And that is one grave out of 16 that Woolley called royal, out of roughly 2,100 burials at one city. If the practice ran across even a fraction of those 16, you are looking at several hundred people, in one cemetery, in one town, in perhaps a century and a half. There is no monument to them. There was never going to be. Their entire memorial, in the whole of the written record of the ancient world, is the closing clause of a list in a poem about somebody else, his beloved palace, retainers, and servants. That is why I am spending time on a sentence that a scribe wrote as a piece of tidying up. And since I have named it, let me deal with the standard of Ur for a moment, because it is the best illustration of a habit I have been warning you about all evening. The standard of Ur is a box, roughly the size of a small case, inlaid on both long sides in shell, red limestone, and lapis lazuli set in bitumen in 3 registers. One side shows what is usually called war, chariots, soldiers, prisoners. The other shows what is usually called peace, animals and goods being brought in, and a seated figure at a banquet with a musician playing a lyre. It came out of PG 779, and it is not a standard. Nobody knows what it is. Woolley found it collapsed beside a man's shoulder and guessed that it had been carried on a pole in procession, and he called it a standard, and the name stuck so hard that it is now printed on the label of one of the most famous objects on Earth. It might have been the sound box of an instrument. It might have been a box for something. The honest answer is that we do not know what it was for, and we are all still using the guess of a man who was standing in a hole in 1928. That is what happens to a plausible interpretation given 90 years and a museum label. Hold that thought, because it applies to a magnetogram from 2003 as much as it applies to a box from 1928. So, what were his beloved objects? The text does not say. The text sweeps them up and closes. But if you want a controlled answer, and I am labeling this as inference from the parallel site, not as text, then the Ur graves tell you what a Sumerian royal household actually put in the ground. Lyres and harps, gaming boards, cosmetic kits, and pins, and tweezers, daggers and spears, and helmets, bowls and cups, and jars of copper and silver and gold and stone, chests, furniture with inlay, jewelry in graded sets, and, in the biggest of them, wagons, with the ox teams still in the traces, and the drivers. That is the picture the phrase his beloved objects is standing in front of. And I want you to stay with the wagons for a moment, because they are the detail that changes the scale of the event in my head. A wagon does not fold up. To put a wagon at the bottom of a shaft, the shaft has to be big enough to take it, and the ramp has to be long enough and shallow enough to walk it down. And the oxen have to walk down too, alive, in harness, with a driver at their heads, because you cannot lower an ox, which means the ramp was not a symbolic feature. It was a road, built to a gradient, so that a team could descend without panicking, into a pit 10 meters deep in front of an audience. Somebody worked that out in advance. Somebody calculated the angle. Somebody decided how many men would be needed at the animals' heads. There is a plan behind that hole, drawn by a person whose job it was, and the plan includes where the drivers would stand. That is the thing about all of this that I cannot get past. None of it is frenzy. Every element we have looked at tonight, the diversion of a river, the ramp, the rows, the graded ornament, the arrangement of the bodies, the placement of the instruments, is the output of planning. Somebody sat down beforehand and worked out the order of events. And in the poem, the same quality is there in the writing. It is a list. Lists are what you make when you intend not to forget anything. And now I have to stop and give you the strongest argument against everything I have said tonight, because it exists. It is published. It is in the Oxford bibliography for this very composition. And if I skipped it, you would be right never to trust me again. Here is the argument. This whole burial passage may not be about Gilgamesh at all. Two names. Johannes van Dyck, publishing in 1967, connected part of this material to a tablet catalogued as VAT-8382, which is a bilingual royal ritual, a text for performing a rite, not a narrative about a particular king. And Klaus Wilke, in 1970, connected this same material to what he described as a fate decision for the dead Ur-Nama, that is, for a completely different king of the third dynasty of Ur, who lived and died centuries after the period in which anyone places Gilgamesh. Put those together, and you get a serious proposition. What if the funeral in this poem is a liturgy? What if the sequence, the levee, the river, the stone chamber, the gold, the roster of the household, the gifts to the powers of the underworld, is a reusable form, a template for the burial and the vindication of a dead king, into which you drop whichever king has just died? Ur-Nama this time, Gilgamesh in the version we happen to be reading. If that is right, then this list is not an account of one grave in a riverbed at Uruk. It is a description of a rite. It tells you what Mesopotamians did, or believed should be done, when a king died, which is genuinely fascinating and genuinely valuable, and is not the same claim as the one in my title. I take that seriously. I take it seriously enough to say that it is probably the single best objection to the way this video is framed, and that the two scholars who raised it are cited in the standard bibliography of the composition, and that I am not able to refute them. What I can do is put three things next to it. The first is that a liturgy and a memory are not exclusive. Rites do not come from nowhere. If there is a reusable royal funeral form in Sumerian, the most natural account of where it came from is that it describes, in stylist terms, what royal funerals had actually involved at some earlier point. The form is evidence about practice, even if it is not evidence about one man. The second is the barber, and the two broken slots beside him. A liturgy would not need the barber. A liturgy needs offices with ritual functions. The presence of the domestic, the specific, and the boring is exactly what you would expect if a real roster stands somewhere behind the form. And the third is Whatever this text is, retainer burial happened. There are 63 people on a floor in one grave and 74 in another, and we have their bones and their ornaments, and in two cases, their CT scans. The practice is not in question. The only question is whether this particular poem is reporting it or ritualizing it. So I will say it as plainly as I can. It is entirely possible that the 12 things in this video describe a ceremony rather than a grave. I think the balance of the evidence sits somewhere between the two, and I'm telling you that at item 11, rather than hiding it, because you have given me 2.5 hours, and you are owed the best case against me. Which brings us to the last one. And item 12 is not like the 11 before it, because every item so far has been a thing or a person that could in principle be put in a hole. Item 12 cannot be dug up, weighed, or photographed. Item 12 is a set of payments, and beside it, in the same composition, is the reason the payments were necessary. Item 12. The gifts for the dead gods and the dead priests, and the one line that names why we die. There are two sources for this item, and I am going to take them in order, because the order is the argument. The first is the gift list. It is in the Nippur version of The Death of Gilgamesh, the section printed in the Oxford Corpus, as another version from Nibru, lines 8 to 28, which is to say it comes off the Nippur manuscripts, the group headed by CBS 6966 with its 5 joined fragments, CDL I number P 264388 in the Penn Museum in Philadelphia. And here is something worth saying out loud. This is the longest and best preserved stretch of the entire burial passage. The part about the wife and the children is broken. The part about the barber has holes in it. The part about the presents runs almost clean. Whatever mattered most to the person who wrote this down, it was not the inventory of the household. It was the inventory of the payments. Here's how it starts, verbatim, in the Oxford translation of 1.8.1.3. Quote, Gilgamesh, the son of Ninsuman, set out their audience gifts for Ereshkigal. He set out their gifts for Namtar. He set out their surprises for Dimpikug. He set out their presents for Neti. He set out their presents for Ningishzida and Dumuzid. End quote. Audience gifts. Stop on that word. An audience gift is the thing you bring when you are going to be admitted to the presence of somebody who outranks you. It is not an offering to a god in the way we usually mean offering. It is the object you put in front of the official before you make your request. Every court in the ancient world ran on it, and every court in a fair number of countries still does. So let me tell you who is receiving. Ereshkigal is the queen of the underworld. She rules it. She does not visit. Namtar is her vizier, her chief minister, and his name means something very close to fate, or the cutting of fate. He is the officer of the death decree. In the literature, he is the one who carries out what has been decided. Dimpikug is a more obscure figure of the underworld, and I am not going to inflate what I know about him. Neti is the gatekeeper. He is the one who stands at the entrance and controls who passes and on what terms, and he appears elsewhere in Sumerian literature doing exactly that with a very great deal of bureaucratic pleasure. And Ningishzida and Dumuzid are two more powers of that world, named again later in the poem in the passage about Gilgamesh's own destiny. Look at the shape of that. A queen, her minister, a gatekeeper, 2 throne bearers. That is not a pantheon. That is a chain of command with a door on it. And the list keeps going. It goes to the ancestors of Enlil. And this is where it gets strange in a way I want you to feel. It names them in pairs, Enki and Ninki, Enmul and Ninmul, Endulkuga and Nindulkuga, Enindashurima and Nindashurima, Enmu Utula and Enmenkara. Notice the pattern in the names. En and Nin, over and over, the male and female forms of the same element. These are the elder generations, the powers who came before the God who runs the world, and this is the point, they are dead. They are the deceased ancestors of a living God. It goes to Shulpai, who carries the title Lord of the Table. It goes to Shumugan, and to Ninhursaga. It goes to the Anuna gods of the Holy Mound, and to the great princes of the Holy Mound. And then it ends here. And this is the sentence I have been walking toward all evening. Quote, the dead and priests, the dead Lager priests, the dead Luma priests, the dead Nindigir priestesses, and the dead Gudu, the linen-clad and ... priests. End quote. The dead priests, not the gods, the clergy. The En, the Lager, the Luma, the Nindigir, the Gudu, those are the actual named ranks of the Mesopotamian priesthood, the offices that existed in the temples of the cities, held by living people with houses and rations and families. And Gilgamesh is bringing presents for the ones who have already died. Read the whole gift list as a single document, and what you are holding is not a prayer. It is a schedule of payments to an organization. The queen who rules the place, her minister who executes the decrees, the gatekeeper who controls admission, the senior figures of the previous administration, who are dead, but evidently still owed something, and the professional clergy of the underworld, who are dead, and who are apparently still working. That is the 12th thing that went into the grave, according to the tablet. Not stone, not gold, not a person. A set of bribes, carried down by a dead king, addressed by name and by rank to the officials of a place he expected to be processed by. And people do not do that unless they believe something very specific about what death is. Let me put a little more under that, because the Mesopotamian underworld is not the afterlife most people are carrying around in their heads, and the difference is the whole reason the gifts exist. There is no reward in it. That is the first thing. In the Sumerian and Akkadian material, the land of the dead is not a place where the good are compensated and the wicked are punished. It is not bright and it is not warm. The standard descriptions give you a house that people enter and do not leave, where the inhabitants sit in darkness, where dust lies on the door and the bolt, and where the food is dust and clay. Everybody goes. The king goes, and the barber goes. What differs is not the destination, but the conditions. And the conditions depend on two things: how you were buried, and whether anybody up here is still bringing you food and water. That second point is the engine of the whole thing. The dead in this world are maintained by the living. Offerings of food and drink are made to ancestors, regularly, as an obligation, and a dead person with no descendants making those offerings is in a bad position, hungry, unattended, and in some texts liable to come back and make trouble about it. A funeral is therefore not a farewell. It is the opening of an account that somebody has to keep paying into, and that is exactly the frame in which audience gifts make sense. If the place you are going has a ruler, a minister, a doorkeeper, and a staff, and if your comfort there depends on how you are received on arrival and on how you are provisioned afterwards, then the sensible thing to carry is not virtue. It is goods, addressed by name, to the people who decide where you are put. Which is why I said at the start of this item that the gift list is the best preserved part of the burial passage. It is not an ornament on the funeral. In the logic of this world, it may be the functional part, the thing that actually does something. And the stone and the gold and the household are the setting in which it is presented, which is where the second source comes in, and this is the one the title of this video is about. The same composition. The Mi-Turan manuscripts, published by Cavigno and Al-Rawi in the year 2000, Oxford translation 1.8.1.3, segment F, lines 23 to 37. And the poem thinks it is important enough that it says it twice, repeating at lines 116 to 130. The setting. The gods are in assembly, deciding what happens to Gilgamesh, and the god Enki stands up and speaks. Enki is the one who, in Mesopotamian literature, over and over again, takes humanity's side. He is the one who warns the flood hero. He is the arguer. And it is worth knowing who is talking, because the identity of the speaker is half the meaning. Enki is the god of the fresh water under the ground, the water in the wells and the marsh and the springs, as opposed to the sea. He is also, in this literature, the god of craft, of cleverness, of the technical fix, and of the loophole. He is the one who finds a way. When the assembly of the gods decides on something catastrophic, Enki is the one who works out how to comply with the letter of the decision while defeating the point of it. In the flood story, he does exactly that. He is bound not to warn the man, so he speaks to a wall of reeds, and the man happens to be on the other side of the wall. So this is not a random god objecting. This is the specialist, the one member of the assembly whose entire character is finding the way around a decision, which is why the oath is aimed at him. You do not bind the god who is going to obey anyway. You bind the one who found the loophole last time, and you bind him with the heaviest instrument you have, a swearing by heaven and by earth, precisely because you know what he is like. And that means the passage contains, embedded in it, an admission. The assembly expected somebody to try again. The oath exists because the exception was possible. Here is what he says. This is verbatim, with the editor's question marks left in, because they are theirs and not mine. Quote, in those days, in those distant days, in those nights, in those distant nights, in those years, in those distant years, after the assembly had made the flood sweep over to destroy the seed of mankind. Among us, I was the only one who was for life. Question mark. And so he remained alive. Question mark. Ziud Surah. Although, question mark, a human being remained alive. Question mark. Then you made me swear by heaven and by earth and ... that no human will be allowed to live forever. Question mark. Anymore. End quote. I want to read the last part again, on its own, slowly. Then you made me swear by heaven and by earth that no human will be allowed to live forever anymore. Anymore. Now. Before I say a single word about what that means, I am going to say what it does not mean, because this is the exact place where every video on this subject goes wrong, and where I am not going to. That line does not say that human beings used to be immortal. It does not say we lost a biological condition. It does not say there was a golden age in which nobody died, and then somebody took it away. Nothing in this text, and nothing anywhere in Mesopotamian literature that I have read, asserts that human beings were once deathless creatures. In the older Akkadian poem Atrahasis, death is part of the human arrangement, essentially from the beginning. Mortality is what humans are for. So if you came here for humans used to live forever, I am not going to sell it to you. And the reason I am not going to sell it to you is that the actual claim is stranger, and it survives scrutiny. And the fake one does not. Here is the actual claim. The text says that after the flood, there was one exception. Ziud Surah, the Sumerian flood hero, the same figure the later Akkadian epic calls Utnapishtim, was a human being, and he remained alive. One god was for life, and because of that god, one man was not killed. That is the exception. And then the assembly closed the exception, not by changing what a human is, by making the god who had argued for life swear an oath, by heaven and by earth, that it would not happen again. That is a procedural act. There is an assembly. There is a dissenting party named. There is a vote, or at least a decision. There is an oath, sworn on the two greatest witnesses available, binding the one God most likely to make an exception in future. And the content of the oath is a permission that has been withdrawn. The word in the translation is allowed. No human will be allowed to live forever anymore. That is not a sentence about biology. That is a sentence about permission. Now, the mainstream reading, and I am going to give it every ounce of its strength, because it is the reading of essentially everybody who works on this material professionally, and it is a good reading. This is an ideology. An ideology is a story that exists to explain why the world is the way it is, why the snake has no legs, why the raven is black, why women suffer in childbirth, why we die. Mesopotamian literature is full of them, and this is one of the central ones. Death was assigned to humanity at, or very near, the making of humanity, and everything that follows is an explanation of why the one apparent exception is not available to you. Ziusudra got a license. The license was explicitly declared non-renewable. The story exists to close the door that the story itself had to open. And the reason the door had to be opened at all is that the flood story required a survivor. Once you have told a tale in which one man escaped the death of everybody, you have a theological problem. Why him and not me? The oath is the answer to that question. It is not describing a change in human nature. It is fencing off a precedent. And there is a second, harder version of the mainstream case that I should give you, which is about the word allowed itself. Translation is not a transparent window. When the Oxford editors write aloud, they are choosing an English word to carry a Sumerian construction, and English legal vocabulary is very rich and very specific in ways that Sumerian may not be. A translator writing in a different decade might have written that no human should live forever anymore, or that no human would live forever again, and those sentences land differently in your ear, even though the clay has not changed. Some of the force I am about to draw out of that line may be an artifact of a translator's choice in the 1990s in Oxford. I do not think it is, because the surrounding apparatus is unambiguous. There is an assembly, there is an oath, there is a named dissenter, And those are not translation choices. They are the structure of the passage. But you deserve to know where the joints are, and that is one of them. That is the scholarly reading, and I think it is largely right, and I am not going to pretend I have overturned it. Here is what I would put beside it, and I am labeling it as a reading, because that is what it is. The interesting thing about this text is not whether the story is literally true. The interesting thing is what kind of story a culture chooses to tell, because that tells you how that culture understood the thing it was explaining. You can explain death as a natural condition. This is what a creature is. It grows and it ends. Nothing was done to you. Plenty of cultures do that. You can explain death as a punishment. Somebody disobeyed, and this is the sentence. Plenty of cultures do that too. This text does neither. This text explains death as a decision, taken at a specific moment, in a meeting, over the objection of one participant, and then locked in place with a legal instrument, an oath sworn by heaven and earth, which in that world is the most binding thing that can be constructed. Mortality, in this poem, is not a fact of nature, and it is not a punishment for sin. It is policy. It has a date, a venue, a dissenting vote, and an enforcement mechanism. And once you have seen that, go back and look at the funeral we have spent the last 3 hours describing, because it stops being a funeral and starts being something else. You do not bribe the weather. Nobody sets out audience gifts for the river when it floods, and nobody carries presents to the officials of a thing that simply happens. But if death is an administration, if there is a queen and a vizier and a gatekeeper and a clergy and a decree that was passed by a body that could in principle have passed a different one, then the whole apparatus makes sense. Of course you bring gifts. Of course you address the gatekeeper by name. Of course you remember the dead priests, because the dead priests are the staff, and the staff is who you actually deal with when you enter any office anywhere. The gift list and the oath are the same document. The oath explains why the gifts are necessary. The gifts are what you do about the oath. That is the argument of this video, and I have now given it to you with the sources named, and you can go and read every one of them and disagree with me. Now let me finish the story, because the Akkadian tradition picks this up 1,500 years later and drives it into the ground with 3 of the cruelest images in world literature. In the standard Babylonian epic, the long Akkadian version, edited by Andrew George of the University of London in his Penguin translation of 1999 and in his 2-volume Oxford Critical Edition of 2003, Gilgamesh crosses the waters and finds Utnapishtim, the survivor, the exception, the one man in the Sumerian passage we just read who remained alive. And Utnapishtim tells him to his face that the thing he came for does not exist. He and his wife were made like gods and settled far away at the mouth of the rivers, and that was a single act by an assembly that will not convene again for this purpose. There is no application form. The grant was made once, and then he sets the test, and the test is perfect because it is not heroic at all. Stay awake, he says, 6 days and 7 nights. If you cannot beat sleep, the small death, the one that takes you every night whether you agree or not, then you have no business asking about the large one. Gilgamesh fails immediately. He sits down, and he is asleep almost at once. And while he sleeps, his hostess bakes a loaf for each day and lines them up beside him, so that when he wakes and claims he only dozed for a moment, the mold on the loaves can tell him how long he was gone. The strongest man in the literature of the ancient world is defeated by the ordinary business of being tired. And then the consolation. There is a plant, he is told, growing on the floor of the sea that makes an old man young again. And Gilgamesh, and this is why the character is great, goes and gets it. He ties stones to his feet. He walks down into the water. He takes the plant. He cuts the stones loose, and he comes up with it in his hand. He does not eat it. He decides to carry it home and test it on an old man in Uruk first. That is a careful, sensible, decent decision. He is going to share it. And on the way home, he stops to bathe in a pool, and he leaves it on the bank, and a snake comes out of the water and takes it. And the snake eats it and slides away, and as it goes, it sheds its skin. The renewal was meant for us. The snake got it. And the proof that the snake got it is that snakes still do that, every year, in front of us, where we can see it. That is the 12th thing. He went into the ground, according to the tablet, with presents for the queen of the dead, for her minister, for the gatekeeper, for the ancestors of a god, and for the dead clergy of the underworld. Because in the world this poem describes, death is not a condition, but an office with a door and a staff. And the door was closed by an oath at a specific meeting over the objection of the one God who was for life. So let me put all 12 in a line, one sentence each, before I let you go. 1. The river Euphrates, dammed and pushed out of its bed by a levee on the city, so that the grave could be built in the dry channel, and the water returned over the top of it. 2. Stone, in a country that has none, itemized down to the walls, the bolt, the thresholds, the door pivots and the latches, with hard diorite named in the Nippur manuscript. 3. Gold, almost certainly leaf hammered over wood and fixed with bitumen, which is exactly the technique Woolley excavated at Ur, and which is the reason any grave gets opened. 4. A thick layer of dark soil and a broken instruction that those searching should not find its precinct, followed immediately by a second, public building set up in the middle of the city. 5. His beloved wife, unnamed in every manuscript we have. 6. His beloved children, plural, against a king list on a clay prism in Oxford that says his son, Ur-Nungal, ruled for the next 30 years. So somebody chose. 7. His beloved favorite and junior wife, a formally ranked position in a household we know from ration lists, carrying the same word of affection as everything else on the roster. 8. His beloved musician, an office called Nar that really existed, whose instrument Woolley lifted out of a death pit at Ur as a cast of an empty space. 9. His beloved cupbearer, and a small plain clay cup that was read for 80 years as the instrument of a chosen death until 2 skulls went through a scanner in Philadelphia on the 15th of April, 2007, and came back with trauma and a metal halo and the word enforceable. 10. His beloved barber, the least glamorous name on the list, and therefore the best evidence that the list was copied from something real. And beside him, 2 ellipses where 2 more professions used to be. 11. His beloved palace retainers and servants, and his beloved objects in one sentence, under one verb, with no change of register between the people and the furniture. And 12. Audience gifts for Ereshkigal, for Namtar, for Dimpikug, for Nete, for Ningishzida and Dumuzid, for the dead ancestors of Enlil, for the Anuna gods of the Holy Mound, and for the dead and priests, and the dead Lager priests, and the dead Luma priests, and the dead Nindigir priestesses, and the dead Gudu priests. The presents you bring to a bureaucracy, because a decision was taken in an assembly, over one god's objection, and sealed with an oath, that no human being would be allowed to live forever anymore. 11 of them are stone, gold, dirt, and people. The 12th is a receipt. And I want to name the shape of the whole thing one last time, because it only becomes visible when you have all 12 in front of you at once. Items 1 to 4 are engineering. A river moved, a chamber built, metal installed, the whole thing capped and hidden. That is a problem of materials and labor, and a Sumerian city could solve it. Items 5 to 11 are people. A household, taken apart and put in the ground in rank order, with the same word of affection on every entry, including the furniture. That is a problem of authority, and a Sumerian city could solve that too. And at Ur, we can see the floor where it was solved. And item 12 is the only one that names the reason. Everything above it is an answer. Item 12 is the question, and the question is, why do we have to do any of this at all? The poem's answer is that somebody decided, in a room, a long time ago, over the objection of one God who was for life, and then made him swear. And this is where I have to tell you the truth about all of it one more time, because we have been together a long while now, and I do not want a single person leaving this video with the wrong thing in their head. Nobody has ever opened it, but somebody wrote down what is inside. Nobody has ever opened it, but somebody wrote down what is inside. No tomb has been excavated. No chamber has been entered. No sarcophagus was lifted. No body was recovered. No giant was found. And the photograph is a Canadian artist's 90 minutes of work over an aerial shot of a mastodon dig in Hyde Park, New York, that came third in a competition in 2002. What exists is a magnetic shadow under a dry riverbed at Uruk, drawn by a man who said out loud that he did not want to say definitely it was the grave, and a broken tablet in a drawer in Philadelphia. CBS 6966. 6 separately cataloged fragments joined across a century that lists what the text says went in. And I want to point at one last thing, and then I will stop. You are still here. It is nearly 3 hours. There was no chamber, no body, no gold on a table, no reveal. I told you at item 2 that a magnetic reading at this exact site has already been proved wrong once. I told you at item 11 that 2 published scholars, Van Dyck in 1967 and Wilke in 1970, tie this material to a reusable royal rite, which would mean the list describes a ceremony and not a grave. I have handed you every reason to switch off. And you stayed. For a list of things that nobody has ever seen, written down by somebody whose name we do not have, about a man who may not have existed, in a language that no one has spoken for 2,000 years. That is the argument. That is item 12, proved on you tonight. Because if death were only a fact about bodies, none of this would hold anybody's attention for 3 hours. It holds you because some part of you is doing exactly what the poem describes, treating the ending as a decision that was taken somewhere, by someone, in a room, and looking for the minutes of the meeting. 4,000 years ago, somebody in Nippur pressed that same instinct into wet clay and listed the presents. If that landed, subscribe. Because this series is going through this material tablet by tablet and object by object, and the next one goes further into the same drawer in Philadelphia and the same broken lines. And tell me in the comments which of the 12 you think was the hardest thing to put in the ground. Not the heaviest, the hardest. I will read them. I always do. Written by the gods, hidden by men.